Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Reeves Halbrook, and after 22 years behind the wheel of a long-haul rig, I figured taking a night shift position as a freight yard shuttle driver would be the easy transition into my golden years that I'd been looking for. I was wrong about the easy part, but not in the way you'd think. The work itself was simple enough, moving containers from one track to another, shuttling empties to storage, prepping loads for the morning cruise. No, what made those nights difficult wasn't the labor, it was the emptiness. During daylight hours, the yard was a living thing, forklifts darting between stacks, loaders shouting coordinates, locomotives grinding back and forth in their endless ballet of commerce. But after 11 at night, when my shift began, the place transformed into something else entirely, something that felt less like a workplace and more like a vast metal graveyard where sound went to die. This particular freight yard sat on the outskirts of Chicago, wedged between the old industrial corridor and a stretch of abandoned warehouses that nobody had bothered tearing down yet. During the day, you could barely hear yourself think over the noise of it all, the pneumatic hiss of air brakes, the clang of containers meeting flatbeds, the diesel growl of engines that never seemed to sleep. But come nightfall, all that activity drained away like water from a tub, leaving behind only the skeletal infrastructure and a handful of us to keep the overnight operations limping along. The yard itself sprawled across maybe 40 acres, with 12 main container tracks running parallel like the strings of some giant's guitar, each one stretching about 400 yards into the darkness. Not all the tracks saw regular use. The front 6 were active daily, but tracks 7 through 12 only got worked during peak seasons, and even then the back 3 were considered semi-retired, ghosts of busier times that management kept threatening to reactivate but never quite got around to it. My first month went by without incident, just the steady rhythm of night work that anyone who's done third shift understands, that particular kind of solitude that comes from being awake while the rest of the world sleeps. I'd show up at 11, check in with Dale Morwick at the security booth, grab my shuttle keys, and head out into the yard. Dale was probably in his mid-50s, had that weathered look of a man who'd seen too many graveyard shifts with eyes that were always a little too alert for someone working nights. He manned the security station, watching banks of monitors that showed camera feeds from every corner of the yard, or at least they were supposed to. Half the cameras were so old they gave you nothing but static and shadows, but Dale watched them anyway with a dedication that bordered on obsessive. The shuttle rig I drove wasn't much to look at, just a heavy-duty tractor with a hookup system for moving containers short distances. The cab was cramped, the AC barely worked, but the engine had enough torque to drag a fully loaded 40-footer without complaining too much. I'd get my assignment list from Dale, or sometimes directly over the radio from Fiona Harrell, the yard coordinator who worked days, but occasionally phoned in special instructions for overnight prep work. Fiona's voice on the radio was always crisp and efficient. No wasted words, just the facts and the track numbers and the timeline. Most nights I'd move maybe 7 or 8 containers, shuttling them from receiving to staging, from staging to the departure tracks, a simple choreography that let my mind wander while my hands did the work. It was during my 4th week that I first noticed something off about track 10. I'd been assigned to move 3 containers from track 10 to track 12, both of which were way in the back of the yard where the lighting was sparse and the shadows ran deep. The tracks back there had this abandoned feeling, even though they were technically still in rotation, like rooms in a house that nobody ever went into anymore. As I approached track 10 in the shuttle, my headlights cutting through the thin October mist that had started rolling in, I caught sight of the locomotive parked at the far end of the track. Nothing unusual about that. Locos got parked on dead tracks all the time when they weren't in active service, but what caught my attention was the light. The rear marker lights on a parked locomotive are supposed to stay steady, a constant red glow so other equipment knows it's there. But this one was flickering, pulsing on and off like it had a loose connection or a dying battery. I slowed the shuttle and watched it for a moment. The light would glow bright for maybe 3 seconds, then fade to black for another 3, then back again, steady as a heartbeat. At first, I figured it was just an electrical problem, probably a corroded wire or a bad relay, nothing that warranted more than a maintenance ticket in the morning. But as I got closer, something about the rhythm of it started to feel wrong. Too regular to be random failure, too deliberate. And in those moments when the light blinked out and darkness swallowed the end of the track, I could swear I saw something else, a shape near the locomotive that shouldn't have been there. When the light came back on, there was nothing, just the hulking silhouette of the locomotive and the empty track beyond it. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks, shadows and light creating phantom images the way they do, but my gut wasn't buying it. I keyed the radio. "Dale, you copy." Static crackled, then his voice came through. "Yeah, Reeves, go ahead." I kept my eyes on the locomotive. "That loco at the end of track 10, you see it on your monitors?" The marker lights acting up, flickering on and off. There was a pause, probably Dale switching camera feeds. Then he came back. "Yeah, I see what you're talking about. Looks like a bad connection. I'll put in a work order for the morning crew." I should have left it at that. Should have just hooked up my container and gotten on with my night. But something made me ask. "You seeing anything else on that camera? Near the locomotive?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Like what?" Dale's voice had an edge to it now. The edge of a man who doesn't like where a conversation is heading. "I don't know. Movement, maybe. Something in the shadows." The radio stayed quiet for what felt like a long time. Then Dale's voice came back, careful and measured. "Reeves, the camera angle on track 10 is pretty limited, and the resolution back there is for shit. If something moved, I probably wouldn't see it unless it was right in front of the lens. Why? You seeing something?" I stared at the locomotive, at the space around it, at the pools of darkness between the stacked containers. Nothing moved, nothing I could point to anyway. "Nah," I said finally. "Probably just tired eyes. I'll grab this container and clear out." Dale didn't respond right away, and when he did, his tone had softened slightly. "Yeah, well, be careful back there. Those rear tracks don't get much foot traffic, and sometimes equipment shifts when you're not expecting it." I acknowledged and signed off, then backed the shuttle up to the first container and hooked it up. The whole time I worked, I kept glancing toward the end of the track, toward that flickering light and the darkness that seemed to pulse with it. And twice more in the split second when the light died, I thought I caught movement, just a suggestion of a shape, low to the ground, near the locomotive's rear wheels. But when I turned my head to look directly at it, there was nothing there, just empty track and the distant glow of the security lights painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. I finished loading the container and drove it over to track 12, then came back for the second one. By then, the mist had thickened, turning the whole back section of the yard into a ghost world where sound seemed to travel sideways and visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet. The shuttle's headlights barely cut through it, creating more shadows than they eliminated. As I approached the locomotive again, the flickering light seemed brighter somehow, more insistent, and the intervals felt shorter, like whatever was causing the malfunction was getting worse. I hooked up the second container quickly, not wanting to spend more time back there than necessary, and that's when I heard it. a sound coming from somewhere near the locomotive. A metallic tap-tap-tap, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone rapping their knuckles on a container wall. I killed the shuttle's engine and listened. The sound continued, faint but steady, tap-tap-tap, pause, tap-tap-tap, pause. It wasn't the random ping of metal cooling or expanding. This had pattern to it. Intention. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The mist pressed against me, cold and damp, carrying the smell of diesel and rust and something else I couldn't quite place, something organic and old. I walked toward the locomotive slowly, my boots crunching on the gravel between the rails, the flashlight beam swinging left and right. The tapping stopped. I froze, listening, but now there was only the distant hum of the yard's perimeter lighting and the faint rush of traffic from the highway a mile away. "Hello?" My voice sounded small and stupid in all that emptiness, the kind of thing people do in horror movies right before things go sideways. Nobody answered, which was both a relief and somehow worse than if someone had. I swept the flashlight across the locomotive's undercarriage, across the coupling mechanisms, across the ground where I'd thought I'd seen that crouching shape. Nothing. Just gravel and rail ties, and the patient rust eating away at everything metal. I was about to turn back to the shuttle when I noticed something I'd missed before. On the side of the locomotive, near one of the access panels, there were marks in the dust and grime that covered the metal. They looked like handprints, except the fingers were too long, too spread out, and they were positioned too high up on the panel, like whoever made them had been reaching up from the ground, or reaching down from above. I stepped closer, shining the light directly on them. They were definitely handprints, or something close enough to make my skin crawl. The dust around them had been disturbed recently too, within the last few hours probably, and there was a smear pattern that suggested whatever made them had dragged its hands downward across the panel before letting go. I keyed my radio with shaking hands. "Dale, I'm at the locomotive. You need to see something." His response was immediate. "What's wrong?" I took a breath. "There are marks on the loco. Handprints, maybe. I don't know what the hell they are, but they're fresh." Static, then. "Reeves, are you saying someone's back there with you?" I looked around, flashlight cutting through the mist. "I don't see anyone, but these marks, they weren't here earlier. I'm sure of it." Dale's voice took on a commanding tone. "Get back to your shuttle right now. I'm sending a patrol." I didn't need to be told twice. I backed away from the locomotive, keeping my flashlight trained on the area around it, watching for movement, for anything. The walk back to the shuttle felt like it took an hour, even though it couldn't have been more than 30 seconds. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, which was ridiculous because the cab doors didn't even have real locks, just those flimsy push-button things that a strong wind could pop open. But it made me feel slightly better anyway. While I waited for the patrol, I kept my eyes on the mirrors, watching the locomotive, watching the space around it. The marker light continued its steady pulse, on-off, and each time it went dark, my imagination filled in the shadows with things that weren't there. At least I hoped they weren't there. The patrol arrived about 10 minutes later, 2 security guards in one of the yard's pickup trucks, spotlights blazing. They got out and walked over to the locomotive with Dale on their radio, and I watched from the shuttle as they examined the panel where I'd seen the handprints. They spent maybe 5 minutes back there, flashlights probing every corner, and then one of them radioed back to Dale. I couldn't hear what was said, but a minute later, Dale's voice came through my radio. "Reeves, the guys checked it out. They see some marks, but nothing that couldn't be explained by maintenance or regular handling. You want to come take another look?" I didn't want to, not really, but I also didn't want to seem like I was losing my mind, so I climbed back out and walked over to where the guards were standing. They showed me the panel, and the marks were still there, but in the combined light of 3 flashlights and the patrol truck's spots, they looked less sinister, more like the kind of smudges that accumulate on equipment that gets handled regularly. One of the guards, a younger guy named Torres, tried to make me feel better. Could be from the last maintenance check, or maybe someone was working on the panel and didn't log it. Happens all the time. I nodded, wanting to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen earlier had been different, more deliberate. We all stood there for another minute, nobody saying much, and then the guards headed back to their truck and I returned to my shuttle. I finished my shift without any more incidents, delivered the last container to Track 12, and drove back to the security booth to check out. Dale was at his monitors as always, but when I walked in, he looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You okay, Reeves?" I shrugged. "Yeah, just spooked, I guess. Not used to working the backtracks at night." He nodded slowly. "Those tracks have a history, you know. Way back, before my time even, there was an accident on Track 10. Worker got caught between a container and a locomotive during a night shift. Crushed him. They say he was on the radio calling for help, but there was too much static, nobody could hear him clear enough to know what was wrong. By the time they found him the next morning, he'd been dead for hours." I felt cold, suddenly, despite the warmth of the booth. "When was this?" Dale scratched his chin. 12, maybe 13 years ago. After that, they closed Track 10 for a while, then eventually reopened it when they needed the capacity. But the overnight guys, they don't like working back there. Say they hear things, see things. Probably just superstition, but you know how it is. I knew how it was. I also knew that I'd be spending a lot more nights on Track 10, whether I liked it or not, because freight yards don't run on feelings. They run on schedules and efficiency, and the simple fact that containers need to move from point A to point B regardless of what ghosts might be lurking in between. I drove home that morning with the sun just starting to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that should have been beautiful, but somehow just felt tired. I thought about those handprints, about the flickering light, about the tapping sound that had stopped the moment I got out of my shuttle. I thought about a man dying alone in the dark, his voice lost in radio static, calling for help that never came, and I thought about the fact that my shift started again in 12 hours, and Track 10 would be waiting for me just like it always was, patient and quiet, and full of shadows that moved when they shouldn't. The next few nights passed without major incident, but the unease I'd felt on Track 10 had settled into my bones like a chronic ache. I went through my routines, moved my containers, checked in and out with Dale, and tried to pretend that the backtracks were just like any other part of the yard. But they weren't. Track 10 especially had taken on a quality that I can only describe as watchful, like the space itself was aware of my presence and measuring me in some way I couldn't understand. The locomotive's marker light continued to malfunction despite 3 separate maintenance visits, and each time the techs would test it, replace components, swear it was fixed, only to have it start flickering again within hours. Eventually, they just gave up and scheduled a full electrical system overhaul for the end of the month, which meant I had to deal with that pulsing light every night like a slow heartbeat in the darkness. It was on my 5th night that things escalated. I was moving a container from Track 11 to Track 10 around 1 in the morning, the yard quiet except for the distant clank of an automated sorting machine and the ever-present hum of the security lights. As I backed the shuttle into position, my radio crackled to life with Dale's voice, but it was distorted, wrapped in layers of static that made his words almost unintelligible. "Reeves, seeing, movement, Track 10, check." The transmission cut off before I could ask him to repeat. I tried to raise him back but got nothing but dead air and the occasional burst of white noise. Not unusual for the backtracks. The radio coverage was spotty at best out there, but the timing felt wrong. I continued hooking up the container, working quickly now, wanting to finish and get out. That's when I noticed the marks. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel beside the rails, except they weren't from any vehicle I recognized. They were too wide apart, and the tread pattern was wrong, too shallow, almost like something had been dragged rather than driven. I followed them with my eyes and saw they led from the locomotive toward the gap between two stacked containers about 50 feet away, then disappeared into the shadows. My first instinct was to get back in the shuttle and radio Dale again, but the radio was still dead, nothing but static and the occasional pop of interference. I stood there for a long moment, the container secured to my shuttle, the smart move sitting right in front of me. All I had to do was drive away and report it when I got back to the booth. But something kept my feet planted. Some stupid curiosity, or maybe just the need to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation for everything that had been happening. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward where the tracks disappeared. The space between the containers was narrow, maybe 3 feet across, forming a corridor that led deeper into the stacks. I could see about 15 feet in before the flashlight beam gave up against the darkness. I called out, "Hello? Anyone back there?" My voice echoed off the metal walls, hollow and strange. No response. I took a step into the corridor, then another, the flashlight sweeping left and right. The tire tracks continued along the ground, clear as day in the dust and debris that had accumulated between the containers. About halfway down the corridor, they stopped, just ended, like whatever made them had simply lifted into the air or ceased to exist. I stood there staring at where the tracks terminated, trying to make sense of it. And that's when I heard breathing. It came from behind me, slow and deliberate, the sound of someone inhaling deeply through their nose. I spun around, flashlight cutting through the darkness, but the corridor was empty. The breathing continued for a moment, then stopped, leaving only the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears. I backed out of the corridor quickly, not quite running, but close enough, and didn't stop until I was back at the shuttle. My hands were shaking as I climbed into the cab and keyed the ignition. The radio suddenly crackled back to life, Dale's voice clear as a bell. "Reeves, you copy? I lost you for a minute there." I took a breath before responding, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah, I'm here." Radio cut out. "I'm at track 10, about to head back with the container." There was a pause. "You sound rattled. Everything okay?" I almost told him about the breathing, about the tire tracks that ended nowhere, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the growing suspicion that talking about these things gave them more power somehow. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just the usual creepiness of the back tracks." Dale didn't sound convinced, but he let it go. "All right, well, finish up and come on in. I got something to show you on the security footage." I drove back to the booth faster than I probably should have, the container rattling behind me on the uneven yard surface. When I got inside, Dale had one of the monitors queued up to a specific timestamp. "This was recorded about an hour ago," he said, hitting play. The screen showed track 10 from an elevated angle, probably the camera mounted on the light pole near the entrance to the track. For several seconds, nothing happened. Just the empty track and the locomotive with its flickering marker light. Then, in the lower right corner of the frame, something moved. It was quick, just a blur of motion, but it was definitely there. Dale rewound and played it again, this time in slow motion. The shape was humanoid, but the proportions seemed off. Arms too long or legs too short. It was hard to tell. It moved from behind one container stack to another, crossing maybe 10 feet of open ground in what looked like 2 or 3 strides, then disappeared. "What the hell is that?" I asked. Dale shook his head. "I don't know. Could be a person. could be an animal, could be a camera glitch. The footage quality is shit, and that camera's been acting up for months. He stopped the playback and looked at me. But here's the thing. That's right around the same time you were out there hooking up your container. Did you see anyone? I thought about the breathing, about the tire tracks. No, I didn't see anyone. It wasn't exactly a lie. The next few nights I started paying closer attention to the patterns, the times when strange things happened, the locations where they clustered. Track 10 was the epicenter, but weird stuff was bleeding over to tracks 9 and 11 as well. Equipment that was parked in one spot at the start of my shift would be in a different spot by morning, moved just a few feet, but definitely moved. Small things at first, a pallet jack, a couple of empty containers, but then bigger stuff. A forklift that should have been in the maintenance bay showed up on track 9 one morning, keys still in the ignition, nobody claiming to have driven it there. Dale reviewed all the security footage from that night and found nothing, just empty frames where something should have been. Cameras must have been down, he said. But we both knew the cameras had been working fine. The timestamps were continuous. There were no gaps. Whatever had moved that forklift had done it without appearing on any of the 6 cameras that covered that area. It was Fiona Harrell who finally forced the issue into the open. She called me directly one night around 2 a.m., her voice tight with frustration. "Reeves, I'm getting reports from the morning shift that containers are showing up in the wrong locations, like someone's moving them during the night and not logging it. Is that you?" I'd been expecting this conversation. "No, ma'am. I'm following my assignment sheet exactly. If containers are getting moved, it's not me doing it." There was a long pause. Then who is? Because, according to the GPS trackers on some of these containers, they're being relocated at times when nobody should be working those tracks. I got a 40-footer that moved 300 feet last night at 2:47 a.m. Your shift, your area, but you're saying it wasn't you. I swallowed. That's what I'm saying. I was on track 6 at that time. Dale can confirm. Another pause. I'll check with Dale, but Reeves, if something weird is going on out there, I need to know about it. This isn't just about logistics anymore. This is a safety issue. If we've got someone unauthorized in the yard moving equipment, that's a serious problem. I agreed and signed off, then keyed the radio to Dale. "You catch that?" Dale's voice came back immediately. "Yeah, I heard. Listen, I'm going to pull all the footage from the backtracks for the last week, see if I can find anything concrete. But Reeves, between you and me, I think we both know what's happening here isn't something that's going to show up on camera." That night, I made it a point to drive past track 10 every hour, even when I didn't have assignments back there. I wanted to see if the pattern held, if there were specific times when the activity peaked. Around 3 in the morning, I parked the shuttle at the entrance to track 10 and just sat there, engine off, lights off, watching. The locomotive's marker light pulsed its steady rhythm, on-off, hypnotic in its regularity. The mist had rolled in again, thicker than usual, turning the stacked containers into vague suggestions of rectangular shapes that seemed to shift if I looked at them too long. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe longer. But nothing happened. No movement, no sounds. Just the quiet and the mist and the flickering light. I was about to give up and head back to my regular rounds when I noticed something in my side mirror. A figure standing about 30 feet behind the shuttle, just at the edge of where the security lights gave up. It was tall, taller than any person should be, and completely motionless. I stared at it in the mirror, afraid to move, afraid to even breathe. The figure didn't move either, just stood there like a statue. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape against slightly less dark surroundings, but there was an unmistakable sense of it watching me, studying me. Slowly, I reached for the ignition and started the shuttle. The engine noise seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. I put it in gear and drove forward, watching the mirror as I went. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stayed there in that same spot, getting smaller as I increased the distance between us. When I'd gone about 100 feet, I stopped and looked back directly, not through the mirror. The spot where the figure had been standing was empty, just mist and shadows and the amber glow of the security lights. I radioed Dale. I just saw someone on track 10, standing behind my shuttle, tall, really tall, just standing there. Dale's response was quick. "Where are you now?" I gave him my location. "Stay there, I'm checking cameras." A minute passed, then 2. Finally, Dale came back. "Reeves, I got eyes on your shuttle right now. There's nobody behind you, nobody on that whole track except you." I looked back again, still empty. "They were there, Dale. I saw them in my mirror, clear as day." There was a heaviness in Dale's voice when he responded. "I believe you saw something, but it's not on camera, and that tells me we're dealing with something that doesn't want to be recorded." The implications of that hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. I finished my shift and went home, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, tall and motionless and watching. The next evening, when I came in for my shift, Dale pulled me aside before I could head out to the yard. "I went through a week's worth of footage like I said I would," he told me, his face drawn and tired. "Found something you need to see." He pulled up a video file on one of the monitors, timestamp showing 3:17 a.m. from 2 nights prior. The view was track 10 again, the locomotive with its flickering light. As we watched, the light suddenly stopped flickering and stayed dark. For about 5 seconds, the whole end of the track was in complete darkness. Then the light came back on, and there was someone standing next to the locomotive. A figure, human-shaped, but wrong somehow, standing absolutely still. The light flickered off again, and when it came back, the figure was gone. Dale played it 3 more times, and each time it was the same. Figure appears during the light cycle, disappears when the darkness comes. "That's not the only one," Dale said quietly. "I found similar footage from 5 different nights, always around the same time, always on track 10, always the same pattern." He looked at me. "I've been doing this job for 18 years, and I've never seen anything I couldn't explain. Until now." Management's response to Dale's findings was predictable and infuriating in equal measure. They reviewed the footage, acknowledged that something appeared to be visible on camera, then promptly declared it to be either equipment malfunction or clever video artifacts caused by the flickering light creating false images. When Dale tried to argue that the pattern was too consistent to be random glitches, they thanked him for his diligence and suggested he spend less time obsessing over grainy night footage and more time monitoring the active parts of the yard. Fiona Harrell was more sympathetic, but equally constrained by corporate policy. "Look, I believe something strange is happening," she told me over the radio one night. "But unless we can prove it's an actual safety hazard or a security breach by an actual person, management isn't going to authorize any changes to operations. They're not going to shut down Track 10 based on weird camera footage and a feeling." So, Track 10 stayed operational, and I kept working it because that was my job. But I started taking precautions. I made sure my flashlight had fresh batteries every night. I kept the shuttle's engine running whenever I was out of the cab on the back tracks. Doors unlocked so I could jump in quick if I needed to. I stopped working Track 10 alone, instead coordinating with Dale so that every time I had to go back there he'd have me on camera and on radio, ready to send help if things went sideways. Not that help would do much good against whatever we were dealing with, but it was better than nothing. The strange occurrences continued and intensified. Containers moved, equipment relocated itself. The flickering light on the locomotive developed a new pattern. Faster now, more urgent, like a heartbeat under stress. And the radio interference got worse. Every time I keyed up near track 10, the static was so thick I could barely hear Dale's responses, and sometimes in that static I could swear I heard words, fragments of sentences. Someone trying to communicate through the noise but never quite managing to break through clearly. It was on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after my first encounter on track 10, that things came to a head. I'd been assigned to move a container from track 9 to track 10 for morning pickup. Routine work that should have taken maybe 15 minutes start to finish. The night was cold, temperature hovering just above freezing, and the usual mist had given way to something denser, almost fog, that reduced visibility to maybe 20 feet. I hooked up the container and started backing into position on track 10, watching my mirrors, taking it slow because the fog made it hard to judge distances. That's when the radio started screaming. Not static, not interference, but an actual scream, high-pitched and agonized, and completely terrifying. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving only the normal background hiss. I slammed on the brakes and grabbed the radio. "Dale, did you hear that?" Nothing. I tried again. "Dale, respond." More nothing. The radio was completely dead. Not even static now. Just the hollow silence of a device that wasn't receiving any signal at all. I was reaching for my cell phone when the locomotive's marker light started strobing, faster than I'd ever seen it. On off, on off, on off, like a strobe at a rave. In the stuttering illumination I could see shapes moving near the locomotive. Multiple figures now, all tall and wrong proportioned, all moving with that same unnatural fluidity I'd seen on the security footage. They seemed to be gathering around something on the ground between the locomotive and the first container, clustered together in a way that made my skin crawl. The light continued its manic flashing, and in the brief moments of darkness between flashes, I could hear sounds, metal scraping on metal, low voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize, and underneath it all, a sound like someone crying. Soft and desperate and utterly hopeless. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out, to put the shuttle in drive and floor it back to the security booth and never come back to the yard again. But there was another part of me, the part that had spent 22 years solving problems on the road, that needed to know what I was looking at. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and got out of the shuttle. The fog swallowed me immediately, thick and cold, and full of that strange organic smell I'd noticed before. I walked toward the locomotive slowly, flashlight cutting a weak cone of light through the murk. The strobing marker light was disorienting, making everything seem to jump and skip like a film with missing frames. As I got closer, the figures I'd seen from the shuttle seemed to fade, becoming less solid, more like impressions left in smoke. But I could still see where they'd been, see the disturbance in the fog where their shapes had displaced the air. I reached the locomotive and shined my light on the ground where the figures had been clustered. There, in the gravel and dirt, was a clear patch, roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, and it was wet. Not damp, but actively wet, with liquid pooling in the depressions and reflecting my flashlight beam. I knelt down and touched it hesitantly, expecting water or oil or some kind of industrial fluid. It was cold, colder than it should have been, and when I pulled my hand back, my fingers were clean. Whatever the liquid was, it left no residue, no trace on my skin. I stood up quickly, wiping my hand on my jacket anyway, and that's when I noticed the marks on the side of the locomotive. More handprints, dozens of them now, covering the entire side panel in an overlapping pattern that looked almost decorative, almost intentional, and they were glowing faintly, a pale, phosphorescent blue that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. I backed away from the locomotive, flashlight swinging wildly as I retreated toward the shuttle. The marker light had stopped strobing and gone dark completely, leaving me in near total blackness broken only by my flashlight and the distant security lights. I made it back to the shuttle and climbed in, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key turned. The engine started with a reassuring roar, and I slammed it into drive and accelerated hard, the unsecured container lurching behind me as I took the turn too fast. I didn't care. I just needed to be away from track 10, away from those figures and those glowing handprints and that inexplicable wet patch on the ground. I made it about halfway back to the security booth before the radio crackled back to life. Dale's voice came through, normal and clear, as if nothing had happened. "Reeves, where are you? I lost you on camera for about 5 minutes there." I tried to respond, but found I couldn't make my voice work properly. Finally, I managed, "Track 10, something happened. I'm coming in." When I got to the security booth, Dale took one look at my face and poured me a cup of coffee from the ancient pot he kept running 24/7. "Talk to me," he said. I told him everything. The screaming on the radio, the dead signal, the strobing light and the figures and the wet patch and the glowing handprints. Dale listened without interrupting, and when I finished he was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled up the camera feed from track 10 and backed it up to the time I'd been out there. We watched in silence as the video showed my shuttle arriving, showed me getting out and walking toward the locomotive, showed me kneeling by something on the ground. But that was all it showed. No strobing light, no figures, no fog, even though I knew it had been thick enough to choke on. Just me, alone on an empty track, appearing to react to things that didn't exist. "It's not recording it," Dale said finally. "Whatever you're experiencing out there, the cameras can't see it, or won't see it." He looked at me. "You believe me though, right? You believe I'm not making this up?" Dale nodded slowly. "Yeah, I believe you. I've been watching these monitors long enough to know when something's wrong, even if I can't see what it is. The question is, what do we do about it?" That became the central problem of my next few shifts. Management wouldn't act on camera footage that showed nothing unusual, and they certainly weren't going to shut down operations because of what they'd inevitably label as worker fatigue or stress-induced hallucinations. But Dale and I couldn't just ignore what was happening either. We started documenting everything, keeping detailed logs of every anomaly, every strange occurrence, building a case that we hoped would eventually be undeniable. Dale dug deeper into the yard's history, pulling up old accident reports and incident logs, and what he found was disturbing. The accident he'd mentioned before. The worker crushed between the locomotive and container. His name had been Thomas Waite, and it had happened on track 10 exactly 12 years ago to the day of my first strange encounter. But that wasn't all. Dale found records of other incidents on track 10 dating back decades. Workers reporting equipment malfunctions, mysterious sounds, sightings of figures that shouldn't have been there. None of it was ever taken seriously, always dismissed as tired workers seeing things or equipment acting up in explicable ways. "It's the track itself," Dale said one night, spreading out printouts of the old reports across his desk. "Something about track 10 attracts this stuff, or maybe causes it, I don't know. But it's been happening for at least 40 years that I can document, probably longer." I looked at the reports, at the patterns that emerged when you laid them all out together. Most of the incidents clustered around certain dates, anniversary dates we realized, times when previous accidents or incidents had occurred. And they all involved the same elements: flickering lights, radio interference, figures seen in peripheral vision or on camera but never directly, the sense of being watched or followed. It was like the track had a memory, a record of trauma that played itself out over and over for anyone unlucky enough to be there at the right time. Or the wrong time, depending on how you looked at it. The night everything changed was a Friday, exactly 12 years and 3 weeks after Thomas Waite's death. I didn't know the significance of the date when my shift started. Dale would tell me later after checking his records. But in retrospect, the signs were there from the beginning. The yard felt different that night. Heavier somehow. The air pressure wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The fog rolled in early and thick, reducing the whole back section of the yard to a maze of shadows and vague shapes. And Track 10 was calling to me. I know how insane that sounds, but I could feel it pulling at me, demanding my attention in a way it never had before. I had 3 containers to move to Track 10 that night, part of a morning shipment that was running ahead of schedule. I saved them for last, putting off the inevitable, but eventually there was no more work to do, and I had to head back there. The first container went smoothly enough, no incidents, no strangeness, just routine work. The second one was where things started to go wrong. As I was backing the shuttle into position, the radio erupted with that same agonized scream I'd heard weeks before, but this time it didn't cut off after a few seconds. It went on, rising and falling in waves of pain and terror, and underneath it I could hear words, fragmented and distorted but recognizable. "Help me. Can't breathe. Please, someone." It was Thomas Waite. I knew it with a certainty that bypassed logic and reason. Thomas Waite calling for help across 12 years of death and silence. His voice still trapped in whatever had happened to him that night, playing out over and over like a recording stuck on repeat. I grabbed the radio and did something I'd never done before. I answered him. "Thomas, I hear you. I hear you calling. But I can't help you. I'm sorry. I can't change what happened." The screaming stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the world had been put on pause. Then a voice came through the radio, clear and calm and terrifyingly close. "He knows. Tell him I know what he did." The radio went dead. I sat there in the shuttle, heart hammering, trying to process what I'd just heard. Tell him I know what he did. Tell who? Know what? Before I could think about it further, the locomotive's marker light began its strobing pattern again, faster and more frantic than ever before. In the stuttering illumination I could see them, dozens of figures now, surrounding the locomotive, all facing toward me, all standing absolutely still. And they weren't vague shapes anymore. They had definition now. Features that were almost human, but not quite. Faces that were stretched and wrong. Bodies that moved in ways that defied physics and biology. They weren't ghosts, weren't anything I had a name for. But they were aware, and they were focused on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I threw the shuttle in reverse and backed away fast, too fast, the container swaying dangerously behind me. The figures didn't move, didn't pursue, just stood there watching as I retreated. When I'd gotten about 200 feet away, I stopped and looked back. The strobing had stopped, and Track 10 was dark again, empty again. Just rails and containers and fog. But I knew they were still there, waiting, patient, existing in whatever space they occupied, whether I could see them or not. I radioed Dale with shaking hands. "I'm not going back to Track 10 tonight. I don't care what management says, I'm not going back there." Dale's voice was understanding. "Copy that. Come on in, we'll figure something out." I drove back to the security booth in silence, and when I got there, Dale had already made the decision that would end my career at the freight yard. "I'm pulling you off Track 10, he said. "Effective immediately. I'll reassign those containers to the morning shift and take whatever heat comes from it. This has gone too far." The heat came fast and hard. Fiona Harrell called Dale before sunrise, demanding to know why 3 high-priority containers were still sitting on Track 9 instead of staged on Track 10, like they were supposed to be. Dale explained that he'd made a judgment call based on safety concerns, which only made things worse. By noon, he was in a meeting with yard management, and by 2 p.m., he'd been suspended pending an investigation into his handling of overnight operations. I tried to intervene, tried to explain what had been happening, but my testimony was dismissed as the ravings of an overworked and overstressed employee who'd been spending too much time alone in the dark. They offered me a week off, paid leave to get my head straight, and suggested I might want to consider a transfer to day shift when I came back. I took the week, but knew I wouldn't be coming back. Whatever was happening on Track 10, I'd pushed it as far as I could, and it had pushed back harder. Dale called me 3 days into my leave. They reactivated Track 10 fully, he said, voice tight with frustration. Brought in a whole new crew, told them it was prime real estate that had been underutilized. They're running containers through there 24 hours a day now. I asked if he'd warned the new guys about what they might encounter. I tried, Dale said. They thought I was messing with them, some kind of hazing ritual for the newbies. Nobody believes this shit until they experience it themselves, and by then it's too late. We talked for a while longer, comparing notes, trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. Dale had done more research into Thomas Waite's death, and what he'd found was disturbing. The official accident report said Waite had been crushed when a locomotive rolled forward unexpectedly, pinning him against a container. But Dale had found an unofficial report, a memo from the night shift supervisor that had been buried in the archives. According to that memo, there had been another worker on duty that night, a man who'd been operating the locomotive. The memo noted inconsistencies in his story, time gaps that didn't match up, and a suggestion that the accident might not have been as accidental as initially reported. But nothing ever came of it. The investigation was closed, the other worker was never disciplined or even formally questioned, and Thomas Waite was buried with the official cause of death listed as workplace accident. "Tell him I know what he did," I said quietly, remembering those words from the radio. Thomas was telling me he knows it wasn't an accident. Dale was silent for a long moment. "The worker who was operating the locomotive that night," he said finally. "His name was Virgil Morwick. He's my uncle. He got me this job." The world tilted slightly. "Dale, I didn't know. I'm sorry." Dale laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Don't be. I didn't know either, not until I started digging. My uncle never talked about his time working the yard, and I never thought to ask. But now, I'm wondering what really happened that night. Wondering if the guilt of it is what drove him to get me hired here, some kind of atonement or penance. He died 3 years ago, took whatever he knew to the grave." We sat with that for a while, the implications hanging heavy between us. Finally, Dale said, "Maybe that's what Thomas wants. Someone to know the truth. Maybe that's why all this keeps happening, why Track 10 won't let anyone forget." I didn't have an answer for that. My week off passed, and I submitted my resignation instead of returning to work. The yard accepted it without much fuss, probably relieved to be rid of a problem employee. I heard through Dale that things on Track 10 had continued to escalate. Equipment malfunctions becoming more frequent, workers refusing to go back there alone, one guy quitting after a single night when he swore something had grabbed his ankle while he was hooking up a container. Management's response was predictable: more cameras, more lights, more supervision, all of it addressing symptoms while ignoring the disease. Dale stuck it out for another month before he was let go, officially for the suspension incident, but really because he kept pushing the Thomas Waite angle and making people uncomfortable. We met up for coffee after he cleaned out his locker, and he gave me a folder full of documents he'd compiled. "I'm done fighting this," he said. "But someone should know the full story, even if nobody's willing to do anything about it." I took the folder home and read through it that night. Every accident report, every incident log, every scrap of paper Dale had managed to collect about Track 10 and Thomas Waite and the history of that cursed section of yard. One document in particular caught my attention. A worker statement from 1979, years before Thomas Waite's death, describing experiences that were eerily similar to what I'd encountered. The lights flickered and I heard voices on my radio, someone asking for help, but the words were all broken up with static. When I went to investigate, I found wet spots on the ground near Track 10 that shouldn't have been there, and marks on the equipment like handprints but wrong somehow. I reported it to my supervisor, but he said I was imagining things, said the stress of night shift was getting to me. Maybe he was right, but I don't think so. The statement was signed and dated, and at the bottom someone had written in different ink, "Employee transferred to day shift at his request. No further incidents reported." That's what Track 10 does, I realized. It shows you things, makes you experience things, and then relies on the natural human tendency to rationalize and dismiss to keep its secrets. How many workers over the decades had seen what I'd seen, heard what I'd heard, and then convinced themselves it was nothing because believing otherwise was too difficult? How many times had Thomas Waite tried to communicate what happened to him, only to be written off as equipment malfunction or worker stress? The system protected itself not through conspiracy but through simple disbelief, through the institutional inertia that treats all anomalies as problems to be managed rather than mysteries to be solved. And the truth was, I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. 6 months later, I was working day shifts at a different freight yard across town. Smaller operation but steady work and no night shifts required. I'd almost convinced myself that Track 10 and everything that happened there was behind me, a closed chapter, until Dale called one morning with news. "You remember that new crew they brought in to work Track 10? One of them finally broke, went to management with the same kind of stories we told. Figures in the fog, radio interference, the whole 9 yards. And here's the kicker, he recorded it on his cell phone. Got clear footage of the marker light strobing and something moving near the locomotive. Management can't dismiss it as equipment malfunction anymore. They're actually going to do something." I asked what they were going to do. Dale's voice was grim. "They're shutting down Track 10 permanently. Tearing out the rails, removing the locomotive, clearing the whole area. They're calling it a decommission for efficiency purposes, but everyone knows the real reason. They finally got spooked enough to act." Part of me felt vindicated, like the struggle Dale and I had gone through hadn't been for nothing. But another part felt sad, like we were destroying something that deserved to be understood rather than erased. "What about Thomas?" I asked. "What happens to him if they tear it all down?" Dale was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. Maybe he finally gets to rest. Maybe he's been waiting for someone to acknowledge what happened to him, and now that people know, he can let go. Or maybe he just moves to a different part of the yard and starts the whole cycle over again. Ghosts aren't my area of expertise." We talked a bit more and then hung up, and I went back to my routine, moving containers in daylight. No fog, no figures, no voices on the radio. Safe and boring and exactly what I needed. But sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I think about Track 10 and Thomas Waite and all the other forgotten dead, whose stories get buried under paperwork and dismissal and willful ignorance. I think about that moment in the shuttle when I answered his call, when I acknowledged that I heard him asking for help even though I couldn't provide it. Did that mean something? Did it matter to him that someone finally listened? I'll never know for sure. All I know is that freight yards are strange places after dark, full of shadows and echoes and histories that refuse to stay buried. The smart move is to do your work and not ask too many questions, and never, ever answer when you hear voices calling from the darkness. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I carry it with me still. A weight that's somehow both burden and blessing. The knowledge that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved and some calls for help come from places we can never reach, no matter how much we might want to try. I drive past that old freight yard sometimes, the one where I used to work nights, and I can see that they've made good on their promise. Track 10 is gone. Nothing but empty gravel and weeds now. The rails pulled up and sold for scrap. The containers relocated. The locomotive hauled away to some other yard where it sits idle and rusting. The space looks cleaner somehow, lighter, like a wound that's finally starting to heal. But I notice that no one parks there. No one uses that section even though it's flat and empty and perfectly good real estate. The yard workers know better. Even the new ones who never experienced what we did. Some knowledge gets passed down person to person, whispered in break rooms and parking lots, stories that teach the unwritten rules. Don't work alone after midnight. Always keep your radio on. Never ignore the warning signs when a place tells you it doesn't want you there. And whatever you do, don't stop to investigate when you hear someone calling for help from Track 10, because Track 10 doesn't exist anymore. And anyone calling from there is calling from somewhere the living have no business going. That's my story, for whatever it's worth. I know how it sounds, I know how easy it would be to dismiss everything I've told you as the product of stress and fatigue and too many nights alone in the dark. Maybe you're right to be skeptical. Maybe that's the sensible response. But I was there, I saw what I saw, I heard what I heard, and I know the difference between imagination and reality, between fatigue and genuine terror. Something was happening on Track 10, something that defied explanation but demanded acknowledgement, and for a brief window of time I was the person who got chosen to witness it. I don't know why me. Don't know what I was supposed to do with that experience beyond survive it and carry it forward. But I do know this. If you're ever working night shift at a freight yard, and the lights start flickering on a dead track, and voices start breaking through the radio static asking for help, believe what you're experiencing and get out. Don't try to be a hero, don't try to understand, just go. Some mysteries aren't worth solving, and some places are haunted not by evil but by sorrow too deep and old to ever truly heal. Walk away while you still can. Thomas Waite never got that chance, and he's been paying for it ever since. I've been driving long haul for 16 years now, and in that time I've learned that the road has its own rhythms, its own rules that you ignore at your peril. My name is Merritt Collings, and most of my runs take me through the industrial corridor that connects the Rust Belt cities, hauling everything from automotive parts to agricultural equipment. Whatever needs moving and whatever pays. The work is solitary but honest, and I've made my peace with the endless miles and the truck stop coffee and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from spending more time with your rig than with people. But there's one freight yard on my regular route that I've never quite made peace with. A sprawling facility outside of Gary, Indiana that serves as a major interchange point for rail and truck freight. Most drivers just drop their loads and move on, but I got into a pattern of taking my mandatory rest breaks there, parking in the truck lot adjacent to the yard and catching a few hours of sleep before continuing on. It was convenient, it was free, and for the first few months it seemed like the smart play. Then the dreams started. The yard itself is old, dating back to the 1950s, when rail freight was king and the Great Lakes industrial belt was still firing on all cylinders. At its peak, the facility must have been impressive, with dozens of active tracks, multiple switching yards, and a constant flow of cargo moving in and out around the clock. But like a lot of infrastructure in the region, it had fallen on harder times. By the time I started using it for overnight stops, maybe half the tracks were still operational, and those were the ones closest to the main gate and the administrative buildings. The back sections of the yard, where the old transfer lines and auxiliary tracks were located, had been mostly abandoned, left to rust and decay, while management focused resources on keeping the profitable sections running. There was talk of demolition and redevelopment, but talk is cheap and demolition is expensive, so the dead tracks just sat there, slowly being reclaimed by weeds and weather and time. I didn't pay much attention to the abandoned sections at first. They were separated from the truck parking area by a chain-link fence and a good 100 yards of buffer space, and they weren't visible from where I usually parked anyway. My routine was simple. Pull in around 10 or 11 p.m., park in my usual spot near the southern fence, set my alarm for 6 hours later, and sleep. The yard ran night shifts, so there was always activity. The distant clank of containers being moved, the occasional diesel rumble of a yard switcher, the harsh sodium lights creating pools of orange illumination against the darkness, white noise that I'd learned to sleep through. But about 3 months into using the yard as my regular stopover, I started having vivid dreams, the kind where you wake up not quite sure if you were asleep or if something really happened. In the dreams, I was walking through the abandoned section of the yard, following rusted tracks that led between rows of decaying boxcars and skeletal freight containers. The light was always wrong in the dreams, too dim to see clearly but bright enough to cast long shadows that moved independently of any light source. And there was always someone ahead of me, just at the edge of visibility, a figure that seemed to be beckoning me forward, leading me deeper into the maze of dead tracks and silent machinery. I'd wake from these dreams with my heart racing and the smell of rust and old diesel thick in my nose, so strong it seemed impossible that it was just imagination. The dreams repeated with variations. Sometimes I was searching for something I'd lost. Sometimes I was running from something I couldn't see, but always I ended up in that abandoned section. Always following those tracks. Always chasing that figure that stayed just out of reach. I mentioned it to another driver once, a guy named Ray, who'd been using the yard even longer than I had, and he just laughed. "Freight yards are liminal spaces, man," he said. "Neither here nor there, neither day nor night. Your brain doesn't know how to process them when you're half asleep, so it fills in the gaps with weird shit. I get dreams about flying forklifts and containers full of screaming. It's just what happens." I wanted to believe him. Wanted to chalk it up to the peculiar psychology of sleeping in industrial spaces, but the dreams felt too specific, too consistent, like they were showing me something real rather than conjuring random imagery. It was Orla Pennick who first told me about the old transfer line. Orla worked as a night mechanic in the yard, one of a skeleton crew that kept the active equipment running during the overnight hours when most of the office staff had gone home. I'd met her at the truck stop diner that sat across from the yard's main gate, one of those 24-hour places that catered to drivers and yard workers and anyone else whose schedule didn't align with normal human hours. She was in her late 40s, compact and wiry, with grease under her fingernails and a no-nonsense attitude that I appreciated. We'd fallen into a casual friendship built on shared coffee breaks and the understanding that comes from both working jobs that kept us awake while the world slept. When I mentioned my recurring dreams about the abandoned section, her expression changed, became more guarded. "You've been dreaming about the transfer line," she said. Not a question, but a statement. The old auxiliary track system in the northwest corner. I asked her how she knew. She stirred her coffee slowly before answering. "Because everyone who parks in that lot long enough eventually dreams about it. It's like the place wants to be noticed, wants people to know it's still there, even though it's been shut down for 20 years. Orla told me the history as she knew it. pieced together from old-timers who'd worked the yard back when the transfer line was still operational. It had been built in the early 60s as a dedicated line for moving hazardous materials, chemicals, and industrial waste that needed special handling and couldn't be mixed with regular freight. The line ran from a receiving platform at the northwest corner of the yard to a staging area about half a mile deeper in, with multiple sidings where dangerous cargo could be isolated and secured. For almost 30 years it had operated smoothly, moving thousands of loads without major incident. Then, in 1994, something happened. The details were murky and the official records were sealed, but the end result was that the transfer line was shut down immediately and permanently. All the equipment was removed or abandoned in place, and access to that entire section of the yard was restricted. They didn't even bother cleaning it out properly, Orla said. Just locked the gates and walked away. There's still boxcars sitting on those sidings, still containers in the staging area, everything frozen in time like somebody hit pause and never came back to press play again. I asked her why they'd shut it down so abruptly. She shook her head. Like I said, the official story is sealed, but the unofficial story, the one the old guys tell when they've had a few drinks, involves a spill. Something corrosive or toxic, or both, leaked from a damaged container and contaminated a section of track. They tried to clean it up, but the soil was too saturated. The contamination had spread too far. Rather than deal with the EPA and the liability and the cost of proper remediation, management just fenced it off and pretended it didn't exist. Out of sight, out of mind. She paused, looking at me over the rim of her coffee cup. But the thing is, if you go back there, which I do not recommend, but people have done, there's no evidence of any spill. No dead vegetation, no discolored soil, no warning signs beyond the standard no trespassing notices. Whatever happened there, it either got cleaned up better than anyone admits, or it wasn't the kind of thing that leaves physical traces. That conversation should have satisfied my curiosity, should have explained away the dreams, as my subconscious processing the stories and the atmosphere of the yard. But it didn't. If anything, it made the dreams more intense, more detailed, like having context gave them permission to show me things I'd been missing before. I started seeing specific landmarks in the dreams, the rusted hulk of a gantry crane that had collapsed across Track 7, a skeletal boxcar with its doors hanging open and something dark visible in the interior, a concrete platform with deep gouges in the surface that looked like claw marks. And always that figure ahead of me, leading me forward. Now I could see it was wearing what looked like a work coverall, though the color was indistinct and the shape seemed to flicker and change when I tried to focus on it directly. The figure would stop at certain points and turn toward me, and though I never could see its face, I got the overwhelming impression that it was trying to show me something, that there was a message or a warning embedded in these nocturnal wanderings if I could just understand it. After a month of increasingly vivid dreams, I made a decision that in retrospect was probably stupid, but felt inevitable at the time. I decided to actually walk into the abandoned section while I was awake, to see if the landmarks from my dreams corresponded to real places, or if my imagination had been fabricating everything. The yard's perimeter fence had plenty of gaps in it. Decades of deferred maintenance creating holes that anyone who really wanted access could easily slip through. I picked a night when my load was light and my schedule flexible, parked in my usual spot, and instead of going to sleep, I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and walked along the fence line until I found a section where the chain link had been peeled back. The gap was narrow, but I managed to squeeze through, and suddenly I was standing in the forbidden zone, the abandoned transfer line stretching out ahead of me in the darkness. The first thing that struck me was how quiet it was. Even though I was only a few hundred yards from the active sections of the yard, the sound of operations seemed muted here, absorbed by rust and distance and the weight of years. The second thing was how familiar everything looked. Not because I'd been here before in waking life, but because I'd walked these exact paths in my dreams dozens of times. There was the collapsed gantry crane, exactly where I'd seen it in sleep, its massive arm bent at an impossible angle and partially embedded in the ground. There was Track 7 with its skeletal boxcar, doors hanging open just like in the dreams. And there, about 50 yards ahead, was the concrete platform with the gouges, though in the harsh beam of my flashlight they looked less like claw marks and more like the kind of damage heavy equipment leaves when it's dragged or dropped. I walked forward slowly, playing the light across the abandoned infrastructure, seeing 20 years of decay compressed into a single frozen moment. Weeds pushed up through rail ties, graffiti covered some of the containers, and everything metal had a thick coating of rust that crunched under my boots when I walked across it. I followed the main transfer line deeper into the abandoned section, past sidings filled with freight cars that would never move again, past loading platforms where concrete had cracked and split from countless freeze-thaw cycles. The darkness here was absolute except for my flashlight. The nearest active section of the yard was too far away for its lights to penetrate, and I had the disorienting sensation of walking through a void where the normal rules of space and time didn't quite apply. After maybe 10 minutes of walking, I reached what must have been the main staging area, a broad expanse of rails and switches where cargo would have been sorted and organized before being moved out. In the center of the staging area was a single boxcar, newer than the others, painted dark blue with faded lettering on the side that I couldn't quite make out. The doors were closed and secured with a heavy padlock, and unlike everything else in the abandoned section, this boxcar looked maintained, like someone had been taking care of it even as everything around it fell apart. I walked around the boxcar slowly, examining it from all angles. The paint was faded but not peeling. The wheels showed signs of recent greasing, and the lock on the doors was modern, maybe a few years old at most. Someone was definitely still using this car for something, or at least ensuring it stayed secured. I reached out to touch the side of the car and jerked my hand back immediately. The metal was vibrating, just slightly, a subtle tremor that I could feel through my fingertips. I put my ear against the wall and listened. From inside came a sound, rhythmic and mechanical, like metal sliding against metal in a regular pattern. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause, scrape. It continued for maybe 30 seconds and then stopped. I stood there frozen, listening to the silence, and then the sound started again. Same rhythm, same mechanical quality. Something inside that locked boxcar was moving, and it wasn't random settling or wind or any other natural explanation I could think of. I backed away from the boxcar and pulled out my phone to check the time. 3:17 a.m. I'd been in the abandoned section for almost an hour, and my alarm was set to go off at 6, which meant I needed to get back to my truck and get some actual sleep if I wanted to be functional for tomorrow's drive. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight caught something on the ground near the boxcar. A set of tracks in the dirt and gravel, wet and muddy despite the fact that it hadn't rained in over a week. The tracks were human-shaped, boot prints roughly my size, and they led from the boxcar toward the western edge of the staging area before disappearing about 20 feet out, just ending as if whoever made them had simply stepped off the face of the earth mid-stride. I followed the tracks to where they terminated and crouched down to examine the ground. The boot prints were clear and deep right up until they weren't. No gradual fading or smearing, just a hard stop with nothing beyond. And the mud itself was wrong, too dark, almost black, with an oily sheen that reflected my flashlight beam in rainbow patterns. I stood there for a long moment, trying to decide if I should investigate further or get the hell out while I still could. Common sense won, barely, and I turned back toward the fence line and my truck. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something in or near that boxcar was aware of my presence and tracking my movements. I didn't look back, just kept my flashlight pointed ahead and my pace steady until I reached the fence gap and squeezed back through into the legitimate part of the world. By the time I got back to my truck, my hands were shaking and my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and sat there for a while just breathing and trying to process what I'd seen. The vibrating boxcar, the scraping sounds, the mud tracks that ended nowhere, all of it felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Wrong in a way that went beyond simple trespassing into an abandoned industrial area. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in my truck watching the fence line and the darkness beyond it, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally came up, I fired up the engine and got back on the road, putting miles between me and that freight yard as fast as legally possible. But I knew, even as I drove away, that I'd be back. The dreams had shown me something real, had led me to that boxcar for a reason, and whatever was happening in the abandoned transfer line wasn't finished with me yet. Not by a long shot. I stayed away from that freight yard for almost 3 weeks, changing my route and timing to use different facilities for my overnight breaks. I told myself I was being smart, avoiding a situation that had all the warning signs of something I didn't want to get involved with. But the dreams didn't stop just because I changed locations. If anything, they got worse, more insistent. The figure in the coveralls now appearing closer, more distinct, and the scraping sound from the boxcar bleeding through into my sleep until I'd wake up with my heart pounding and that rhythmic scrape, pause, scrape echoing in my memory. Other drivers started commenting on how tired I looked, asking if everything was okay, and I'd make up excuses about insomnia or schedule problems. Anything to avoid explaining that I was being haunted by dreams of an abandoned freight yard and a locked boxcar that vibrated with unseen activity. Finally, I gave up trying to avoid it and returned to the Gary yard, parking in my usual spot and forcing myself to go through my normal routine. But normal was relative now, and I found myself lying in my bunk with eyes wide open, listening to the sounds of the yard and trying to distinguish between ordinary industrial noise and anything that might be coming from the abandoned section. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and went for a walk, not toward the fence gap, but just around the truck parking area, trying to clear my head. That's when I ran into Bo Laramie, the freight checker who worked the night shift verifying loads and updating manifests. Bo was in his early 30s, tall and rangy with a perpetual expression of mild amusement, like he found something inherently funny about the absurdity of working nights in a half-dead freight yard. We'd talked a few times before, casual conversations about loads and schedules and the general dysfunction of the logistics industry, but never anything deeper. He was standing near the gate, smoking a cigarette when I approached, and he nodded in greeting. "Can't sleep either, huh?" I shook my head. "Something like that. You work this shift long?" Bo exhaled smoke and shrugged. "About 6 months. Needed the shift differential pay and didn't mind the hours. It's quiet mostly, plenty of time to think." He paused, studying me. "You're the guy who parks here regular, right? The one who's been asking about the old transfer line." I felt a chill despite the mild night air. "Who told you I was asking about it?" Bo smiled slightly. "Orla mentioned it. She worries about drivers poking around back there, thinks someone's going to get hurt on the old equipment or fall through rotten decking or something. But between you and me, I don't think physical safety is what she's really worried about." He took another drag on his cigarette. "You've been back there, haven't you? Saw the blue boxcar?" It wasn't a question, so I didn't bother denying it. "Yeah, I saw it. What's the story with that thing?" Bo flicked ash and looked toward the dark section of the yard where the transfer line lay invisible beyond the fence. "The story, as far as I know it, is that boxcar was the last piece of equipment to use the transfer line before it got shut down. It was carrying something, nobody seems to know exactly what, and when they went to unload it, they found the cargo had been damaged, compromised somehow. Protocol said they should empty the car and decontaminate it, but instead they just locked it and left it sitting there. Been sitting there for 20 years now, and as far as I can tell, nobody's ever opened it to see what's inside. I asked why someone didn't just cut the lock and deal with whatever was in there. Bo laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because whatever's in there isn't sitting still. You heard the scraping, right? That's why nobody wants to open it. Something inside that car is active, moving, maybe alive, and the prevailing wisdom is that it's better to leave it locked than to find out what happens when you let it out. We stood in silence for a moment, the implications of that hanging between us. Finally, I asked, "You believe that? You think there's something alive in there?" Bo stubbed out his cigarette. "I believe that sound you heard is real, and I believe it's been making that sound for 20 years, according to the few people who've been back there to check on it. What's making the sound, that's above my pay grade. Could be some kind of chemical reaction, could be structural settling, could be something else entirely. But here's what I know for sure. Every night around 3:17, exactly 3:17, the sound gets louder. You can actually hear it from the active section if you're out in the yard and it's quiet enough. Scrape, pause, scrape, regular as clockwork, going for maybe 10 minutes and then stopping. It's been doing that for as long as anyone can remember." I felt cold again. 3:17 was exactly when I'd heard it in person, and it was approximately when the dreams always reached their peak intensity. "What's significant about that time?" I asked. Bo shrugged. "No idea. Maybe that's when the contamination event happened. Maybe that's when they locked the car. Maybe it's completely random. But it's consistent. You can set your watch by it." I thanked Bo for the information and headed back to my truck. But sleep was even more impossible now. At 3:15, I found myself sitting up in my bunk, watching the clock on my phone, waiting. 3:16, 3:17. And right on schedule, faint but unmistakable, I heard it, scrape, pause, scrape. The sound carried across the distance from the abandoned section, thin and metallic and persistent. I listened to it for the full 10 minutes Bo had mentioned, counting the rhythm, trying to find any variation in the pattern. There was none. At 3:27 exactly, the scraping stopped and silence returned. I sat there in the dark, feeling my skin crawl, knowing that tomorrow I was going to have to go back to that boxcar, knowing that whatever was happening there was connected to the dreams, and connected to me in ways I didn't yet understand, but couldn't ignore. The next night, I prepared more thoroughly. I brought a better flashlight, a crowbar in case I needed to pry anything open, and my phone fully charged with the camera ready to document whatever I found. I waited until 2:30 a.m. to make my approach, giving myself plenty of time to get to the staging area before the 3:17 window. The fence gap was exactly where I'd left it, and I slipped through with practiced ease, my eyes already adjusted to the darkness. The walk to the staging area felt shorter this time, more familiar, and I realized with some unease that I could probably navigate these abandoned tracks blindfolded now. The layout burned into my memory from countless dream repetitions. The blue boxcar sat exactly as before, silent and waiting, the modern lock gleaming dully in my flashlight beam. I approached it slowly, listening for any sound, any indication that the scraping had started early. Nothing yet, just the ambient noise of the wind moving through the decaying infrastructure. I checked my phone, 2:53. 24 minutes until the regular pattern was supposed to begin. I used the time to examine the boxcar more thoroughly, looking for any clue about its contents or its history. The faded lettering on the side turned out to be a serial number and a hazmat classification code, though the code itself had been partially painted over, obscuring the specific designation. I took photos of everything, the lock, the serial number, the wheels, the general condition of the car. Around 3:10, I noticed the mud tracks again, same as before, leading from the boxcar and terminating abruptly. But there was something new this time. A second set of tracks parallel to the first, also ending in that same impossible way. And these were fresh. The mud still damp and glistening, 3:15. I positioned myself near the boxcar's side wall, hand pressed against the metal, phone ready to record. 3:16. I could feel my pulse quickening. That anticipatory tension of waiting for something you know is coming but can't quite prepare for. 3:17. The vibration started first, subtle but distinct, and then the scraping began, louder than I'd heard it before, louder because I was right next to the source. Scrape, pause, scrape. The sound was coming from inside the car, definitely, and it had a specific quality that I hadn't noticed from a distance. A wetness to it, like metal dragging through something viscous. I pressed my ear against the wall and listened, trying to determine the exact location of the sound within the car. It seemed to be moving, starting from one end and progressing towards the other, then stopping and repeating the pattern. Scrape, pause, scrape. I started recording video, panning slowly from the lock to the wall where I had my ear pressed to the ground where the mud tracks emerged. The scraping continued, relentless and mechanical, and I found myself counting the intervals, 8 seconds of scraping, 4 seconds of pause, 8 seconds of scraping. The pattern held for the full 10 minutes that Bo had described, and then at 3:27 exactly, it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound had been, a void that seemed to swallow all the ambient noise of the yard. I stood there with my phone still recording, breathing hard, waiting to see if anything else would happen. That's when I noticed movement near the western edge of the staging area, right where the mud tracks terminated. A shape in the darkness, roughly human-sized, standing absolutely still about 40 feet away. I swung my flashlight toward it, and the beam caught a figure wearing a coverall, dark blue or gray in the harsh white light, facing toward me. The face was in shadow, but I could see enough to know this was a real person, not a dream manifestation, someone actually standing there watching me. I called out, "Hey, you work here?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. I took a step forward. "I'm just looking around, didn't mean to trespass. You want me to leave?" Still no response. I took another step and the figure moved, not toward me, but sideways. A quick sliding motion that didn't look like normal walking. Then it was gone, vanished into the maze of abandoned equipment as completely as if it had never been there. I ran to where it had been standing, flashlight swinging wildly, and found fresh mud tracks. The same impossible tracks that ended abruptly, leading from where the figure had stood straight to nowhere. I got out of the abandoned section faster than I'd entered. Not quite running, but close enough, my mind spinning with what I'd just witnessed. Back in my truck, I reviewed the video I'd recorded, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. The scraping sound had recorded perfectly. You could hear it clear as day on the playback. But the figure at the end, when I'd swung the camera toward it, there was nothing on the video. Just empty space where I knew someone had been standing. I watched that section 3 times, frame by frame, and there was no one there, just shadows and the distant outline of abandoned equipment. Either my eyes had played tricks on me or the camera had failed to capture something that was objectively present, and neither explanation was comforting. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night, just sat in my cab reviewing the footage and trying to make sense of what I was dealing with. By dawn, I'd made a decision. I needed to know what was in that boxcar. Needed to understand what was making the scraping sound and why it happened at the same time every night. And I needed to find out who or what that figure in the coverall was. The figure from my dreams that apparently existed in waking reality too, at least enough for me to see it even if cameras couldn't. The smart play would have been to walk away, to find a different yard for my overnight stops and let whatever mysteries haunted this place remain mysteries. But I've never been particularly good at the smart play, and besides, I was in too deep now. The dreams had led me here for a reason, and I was going to see it through to whatever end was waiting. Over the next week, I established a new routine. I'd arrive at the yard in the early evening, park my truck, and spend the hours until 3 a.m. doing research, talking to anyone who might have information about the abandoned transfer line and the blue boxcar. Orla became my primary source, though she was reluctant at first to share what she knew. "This isn't idle curiosity anymore, is it?" she asked me one night at the diner. "You're actually trying to figure out what's going on back there." I admitted I was. She sighed and ordered another coffee before continuing. "All right, but you need to understand something first. The people who work this yard, the ones who've been here long enough to remember when the transfer line was active, they don't talk about it publicly for a reason. There's a kind of unspoken agreement that what happened back there stays back there, that bringing it up serves no purpose except to make people uncomfortable." I promised I'd be discreet, and she seemed to accept that. According to Orla, the contamination event that shut down the transfer line wasn't what management claimed it was. The official story is chemical spill, right? Some corrosive industrial shit leaked from a damaged container and contaminated the soil, but the workers who were actually there that night, and I've talked to 3 of them over the years, they all say the same thing: there was no spill. What happened was that they opened a boxcar, that blue boxcar specifically, to verify its cargo against the manifest. The paperwork said it was carrying industrial solvents, standard hazmat stuff that they'd handled 1,000 times before. But when they cracked the seal and pulled the door open, what they found inside wasn't solvents. She paused, looking uncomfortable. They won't describe it exactly, won't say what they saw, but all 3 of them refused to go anywhere near the abandoned section now. One guy quit the next day and never came back. Another one transferred to day shift and took a pay cut to avoid working nights. The third one, he still works here, but he drinks too much and jumps at shadows. I asked her what she thought they'd seen. Orla shook her head. "I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to know. But here's what I can tell you. After that night, management sealed the boxcar immediately and evacuated the entire transfer line section. They brought in some kind of specialist team, not regular hazmat, but something else. Military, maybe, or private contractors. Nobody seems sure. These specialists spent 3 days in the abandoned section wearing full containment suits, and when they left they told management to lock it all down and forget it existed. No cleanup, no remediation, just containment. The boxcar got a new lock and the whole section got fenced off, and that was the end of it." She looked at me seriously. "Whatever's in that car, Merritt, it's been locked away for 20 years for a reason. Maybe you should let it stay that way." But I couldn't let it stay that way. Not with the dreams intensifying every night and the scraping sound calling to me like some kind of auditory beacon. I started spending more time in the abandoned section, mapping out the layout, documenting the various pieces of equipment, looking for any clue that might explain the mud tracks, or the figure in the coverall, or the nightly mechanical scraping. I found old manifests tucked into a rusted filing cabinet near the main platform, water damaged and barely legible, but still containing fragments of information about what had moved through the transfer line. Most of it was routine, chemicals and industrial waste bound for proper disposal facilities, exactly what you'd expect. But there were gaps in the records, whole weeks where no cargo was logged despite evidence that the line had been active. And some of the entries that did exist had been redacted, black marker obscuring the cargo descriptions and destination codes, leaving only the dates and times. Bo Laramie turned out to be more helpful than I'd expected. He'd only been working the yard for 6 months, but he was curious and observant. and he'd noticed patterns that the old-timers had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. "The forklift," he said one night when I asked if he'd seen anything unusual. "There's this old forklift that's supposed to be parked in Bay 3 when not in use, but almost every morning I come in and it's been moved. Sometimes it's on the other side of the yard. Sometimes it's just a few feet from where it should be, but it's never where it's supposed to be." I asked if anyone drove it during the night. Bo shook his head. "That's the thing. Nobody has access to the keys except the day shift supervisor, and he swears he locks them in his office every night. But the forklift moves anyway, and there's never any sign of forced entry to get the keys." He paused. "I started checking the forklift's position before I leave and comparing it to where it is when I come back, and I've noticed it always moves in the same direction. West, toward the abandoned section." That detail stuck with me, gnawed at me during the days when I was supposed to be sleeping but couldn't. Everything seemed to be pointing toward the abandoned section, toward that blue boxcar with its rhythmic scraping and its unknowable contents. The dreams were now incorporating details I couldn't possibly have known, showing me spaces within the transfer line that I hadn't explored yet, but that turned out to be exactly as depicted when I went looking for them. I dreamed of a maintenance shed with a broken window and 3 chairs arranged in a triangle, and when I found the shed the next night, the window and chairs were exactly as shown. I dreamed of a specific pattern of rust on a container wall, and the next day I found that exact pattern on a container I'd never consciously examined. It was like the place was downloading information directly into my subconscious, preparing me for something, though I couldn't guess what. The night I decided to cut the lock on the boxcar, I made sure to tell someone where I was going. I left a note in my truck with Orla's contact information and a brief explanation of what I was attempting. Insurance in case something went wrong and I didn't come back. The crowbar I'd brought earlier turned out to be insufficient for the heavy-duty lock, so I'd purchased bolt cutters from a hardware store, industrial-grade ones capable of cutting through hardened steel. I waited until 2:30 a.m. as usual, giving myself plenty of time to get positioned before the 317 window. The walk to the staging area was routine now, almost comfortable, though my hands were slick with nervous sweat as I approached the blue boxcar. The bolt cutters felt heavy and significant in my grip, like I was carrying a weapon rather than a tool, and in a sense I suppose I was. I was about to breach a seal that had been in place for 20 years, about to open something that multiple people had warned me to leave alone. I positioned the bolt cutters on the lock's shackle and applied pressure. The hardened steel resisted at first, but the cutters were high quality, and I was motivated. With a sharp crack, the shackle parted, and the lock fell to the ground, landing in the mud with a wet plop. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the now unlocked door. It would be easy to walk away now, to tell myself I'd satisfied my curiosity and didn't need to actually see what was inside. But I'd come this far, and besides, it was 3:10, which meant the scraping would start in 7 minutes, and I wanted to be ready. I pulled the heavy door open, the hinges screaming in protest after decades of disuse, and shined my flashlight into the interior of the boxcar. At first I couldn't process what I was seeing, my brain refusing to make sense of the visual information it was receiving. The interior of the car was wrong, impossible, the dimensions not matching the exterior. It should have been maybe 40 feet deep, but the flashlight beam stretched into darkness that suggested a space much larger, maybe infinitely larger. And the walls weren't metal anymore, weren't anything I could identify. They had a quality that reminded me of organic tissue, wet and textured and slightly mobile, like they were breathing slowly. The floor was covered in that same black mud I'd seen in the tracks outside, pooled in places and running in rivulets toward unseen drains. And in the center of the space, about 20 feet in, there was something large, something that my flashlight couldn't fully illuminate because it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The shape was vaguely rectangular, maybe 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, and it was moving, rocking back and forth in a slow rhythm. Scrape, pause, scrape. The sound was coming from the shape as it dragged against the floor, and now that I could see the source, I realized it wasn't mechanical at all. It was deliberate, purposeful, like the movement of something trying to get someone's attention. I took a step into the boxcar and immediately felt wrong, like I'd crossed a threshold that my body knew I shouldn't have crossed. The air inside was thick and wet and tasted of rust and decay, and something else, something chemical that made my eyes water. 3:17. The scraping intensified, the shape's movement becoming more agitated, more insistent. I raised my phone to take a video and the screen immediately glitched, showing static and fragments of images that couldn't be real. Faces in the static, hands reaching from the walls, symbols that hurt to look at directly. I lowered the phone and the glitches stopped, the screen returning to normal. Whatever was in this space didn't want to be documented, didn't want to exist in any form except immediate experience. I took another step forward, drawn by morbid curiosity and the sense that I'd been brought here for a specific purpose, that all the dreams and all the signs had been leading to this moment. The shape rotated toward me, and I saw that what I'd mistaken for a rectangular object was actually a figure, tall and hunched and wearing the remnants of a coverall that had fused with its skin in places. The face, if you could call it that, was a mass of tissue that suggested eyes and a mouth but didn't quite resolve into anything recognizably human. And it was looking at me, focusing on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The scraping sound came from its feet as it dragged itself forward, moving toward me with agonizing slowness, and I could see now that the floor was scarred with decades of these same drag marks, deep grooves worn into whatever material the floor was made of. This thing had been scraping its way forward for 20 years, moving inch by inch toward the door that had remained locked until I'd opened it. And now I'd given it access, had breached the containment that had kept it trapped in this impossible space. I backed towards the door, flashlight shaking in my hand, but the figure kept coming, kept scraping forward, and I realized with horror that it wasn't threatening me, it was trying to reach me, trying to communicate something through its agonized movement. I forced myself to stop retreating, to stand my ground as it approached. When it was maybe 5 feet away, it stopped, the scraping ceasing abruptly, and raised one misshapen hand toward me. In its palm was something small and metallic, a badge or a tag, and even in the poor light I could make out letters engraved on its surface. I leaned closer, squinting to read, and felt my blood run cold when I made out the words, Thomas Waite, Yard Operations. I stood there frozen, staring at the badge in the creature's palm, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. Thomas Waite was the name of the worker from the other yard, the man who'd died in an accident 12 years ago, the man whose ghost supposedly haunted Track 10 at the Chicago facility. But this couldn't be him, couldn't be the same person, because that made no sense. Implied connections across space and time that defied rational explanation. Yet here was his badge, held in the hand of something that had once been human, and had spent 20 years scraping its way across the floor of an impossible space inside a locked boxcar. The creature made a sound, a wet rattling that might have been an attempt at speech, and extended the badge toward me more insistently. I reached out slowly and took it from its palm, the metal warm and slick with the same oily substance that covered everything in this space. The moment the badge touched my skin, I felt a jolt of something. Not electricity, but information, images and sensations flooding into my mind too fast to process consciously. I saw the night the transfer line was shut down, Saw workers opening this boxcar and finding not industrial solvents but something else. Something alive and aware and angry. I saw them trying to close the door. Saw one worker, young and terrified, getting pulled inside as the others fled. I saw the specialist team in their containment suits examining the boxcar's interior and making the decision to seal it permanently, knowing that someone was still inside, still alive, but determining that the risk of opening it again was too great. I saw that worker, Thomas Waite, because it was him somehow. It was the same man whose death in Chicago had haunted Track 10, trapped in this space as the days became weeks, became years. His body changing, adapting to the environment, becoming something else while his mind remained horribly intact. The images stopped, and I staggered backward, nearly dropping the badge. The creature watched me with those suggestion of eyes, waiting for some response, some acknowledgement. "How?" I managed to say. "How are you here? How is this possible?" The rattling sound came again, and this time I understood it wasn't trying to speak. It was trying to show me something. It turned its misshapen form and pointed toward the back of the impossible space, toward darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. I followed its gesture and saw there were other shapes back there, other figures standing or crouched or prone, all of them silent, all of them wrong, in the same way this creature was wrong. How many people had been pulled into this space over the decades? How many workers had vanished without explanation, written off as job abandonment or listed as missing persons whose cases went cold? This boxcar was a trap, a collection point, and Thomas Waite was just one of many who'd been caught in it. I looked at the badge in my hand, at the name engraved in metal that was now my burden to carry. "I'll tell someone," I said, though I had no idea who would believe me or what could possibly be done even if they did. "I'll make sure people know what happened here." The creature made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been something else entirely, and then it turned and began scraping its way back toward the center of the space, back to whatever purpose or punishment it had been engaged in for the last 2 decades. I watched it go, watched the other figures deeper in the darkness shift and move, and then I backed out of the boxcar and into the normal world, pulling the door closed behind me. The hinges screamed again, and the door settled into place with a heavy thud that felt final, terminal, like the sound a coffin makes when the lid closes. I stood there in the abandoned staging area holding Thomas Waite's badge, trying to decide what to do next. The smart play was to run, to get back to my truck and drive away and never return to this freight yard or any other yard where shadows moved wrong and sounds came from places they shouldn't. But I couldn't do that. Couldn't just walk away with this knowledge and these images burned into my memory. I pulled out my phone and called Orla, not caring that it was almost 4 in the morning and she'd be asleep. She answered on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep. "Merritt, what's wrong?" I told her everything. The opened boxcar, the creature inside, the badge, the other figures, all of it spilling out in a rush of words that probably sounded insane. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence before she spoke. "Are you still in the abandoned section?" I confirmed I was. "Get out of there right now. Come to the diner. I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. I made my way back to the fence gap and squeezed through, Thomas Waite's badge heavy in my pocket. The walk to the diner felt surreal, like I was moving through a world that had fundamentally changed, even though everything looked the same. Orla was already there when I arrived, sitting in our usual booth with 2 cups of coffee steaming on the table. She looked tired and worried and deeply unsurprised by what I'd told her over the phone. I sat down and placed the badge on the table between us. She stared at it for a long moment without touching it. "I was afraid something like this might happen," she said quietly. That's why I tried to warn you off. The yard has a history, Merritt, a history that goes back further than anyone wants to admit. People disappear here, have been disappearing here since the place was built. Not often enough to draw attention, maybe one every few years. Always someone whose absence could be explained away as job abandonment or personal choice. But they didn't leave, did they? They went into that boxcar or places like it. Places that exist in the spaces between normal geography. I asked her how she knew all this. Orla wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and stared into the dark liquid. My father worked this yard for 30 years, maintenance crew same as me. He told me stories before he died, stories about the places in the yard where the walls were thin, where things from somewhere else could push through into our world. The transfer line was one of those places, maybe the worst of them, and that's why it got used for hazmat cargo. The contamination wasn't chemical, it was dimensional, metaphysical, whatever term makes you comfortable. Something on the other side wanted access to our world, and the cargo moving through the transfer line gave it a foothold. The blue boxcar isn't a container, it's a doorway, and it's been collecting people for decades. She looked up at me. Opening that door was the worst thing you could have done, Merritt. Now it knows you, knows you're aware of it, and it's not going to leave you alone. The next few days proved her right. The dreams intensified to the point where I couldn't distinguish between sleep and waking, the boundaries blurring until I'd find myself in my truck cab with no memory of how I'd gotten there or what I'd been doing for the last few hours. The figure in the coverall appeared everywhere now, not just in the abandoned section but in normal parts of the yard, standing at the edges of parking lots visible in the background of security footage, always watching, always waiting. Other drivers started avoiding me, sensing something off even if they couldn't articulate what. My loads got dropped or reassigned, clients requested different carriers, and within a week I was effectively blacklisted from the routes that had been my bread and butter for years. It was like the yard's contamination was spreading outward from me, using me as a vector to infect the larger world. Bo Laramie was the one who finally forced a confrontation. He cornered me one night near the fence line, his usual easy demeanor replaced by something harder, more desperate. "Whatever you brought back from that boxcar, you need to return it," he said without preamble. "The forklift isn't just moving anymore. It's leaving the yard entirely. I found it 3 miles away yesterday, parked on the side of the highway pointing back toward this place, and the mud tracks, they're everywhere now, not just in the abandoned section. I found them in the office, in the break room, in my goddamn truck. You opened something that was supposed to stay closed and now we're all going to pay for it." I pulled out Thomas Waite's badge and showed it to him. "This is what I brought back. It's proof of what happened. Proof that people have been disappearing into that boxcar." Bo looked at the badge with something like horror. "I don't care about proof. I care about making this stop. Take it back. Put it in the boxcar, close the door and walk away. That's the only way this ends." But I couldn't do that. Couldn't condemn Thomas Waite and all the others to continued imprisonment in that impossible space just to restore normalcy to the yard. There had to be another way. Some solution that didn't involve pretending the problem didn't exist. I spent the next week researching, digging through old newspapers and accident reports and missing persons databases, building a timeline of disappearances that stretched back 40 years. Every few years, like clockwork, someone associated with the yard would vanish without a trace. Workers, drivers, even the occasional inspector or safety auditor, all of them last seen near the transfer line section. All of them written off as voluntary departures or unsolved mysteries. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it, and I compiled everything into a document that I planned to take to law enforcement, to the media, to anyone who would listen. Orla tried to talk me out of it. "You're not going to save anyone. You're just going to mark yourself as crazy and dangerous. Nobody wants to know the truth about what's in that boxcar, Merritt. The people who could do something about it have known for decades and chosen not to act because the alternative is worse. You think opening it and letting those things out is mercy? You think they're still human enough to want freedom? They've been in there for years, some of them decades, transformed by that environment into something that can't survive in our world. The kindest thing you can do is leave them where they are and try to move on with your life." But I couldn't move on, couldn't function knowing what I knew, carrying Thomas Waite's badge in my pocket like a weight that grew heavier every day. The night I went back to the boxcar with the intention of forcing it fully open, documenting everything inside, and calling the authorities regardless of the consequences, I wasn't alone. The figure in the coverall was waiting for me at the fence gap, standing silent and patient as I approached. Up close, I could see details I'd missed before. The way the fabric had merged with skin, the way the limbs bent at angles that suggested broken bones that had healed wrong, the complete absence of anything recognizably human in the face. This was what Thomas Waite had become, what awaited all of us if we spent enough time in that contaminated space. The figure didn't try to stop me as I squeezed through the fence, just followed at a distance as I made my way to the staging area. The blue boxcar's door was standing open, swinging slightly in the night breeze, though I'd closed it firmly the last time I was here. Someone or something had opened it again, and I could see shapes moving in the darkness inside. More active than before, almost agitated. I approached the threshold and looked in, and what I saw made me understand why Orla had been so insistent that I leave this alone. The impossible space inside the boxcar had grown, expanded beyond any rational geometry, and it was full now, packed with figures in various stages of transformation. Some still mostly human, others barely recognizable as having ever been alive. And they were all looking at me, all focused on the open door and the world beyond it, hungry for escape, for freedom, for a chance to exist somewhere other than this trapped pocket of wrongness. If I documented this, if I brought authorities here and forced them to deal with it, what would happen? Would they try to help these people, try to reverse whatever had been done to them? Or would they do what the specialist did 20 years ago, seal it up and pretend it didn't exist because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate? I stood there paralyzed by indecision, and that's when the figure beside me, the one I'd come to think of as Thomas Waite, even though it bore almost no resemblance to whoever Thomas Waite had been, reached out and gently took the badge from my hand. It looked at the piece of metal for a long moment, and I could swear I saw something like recognition or grief pass across its ruined features. Then it stepped through the door into the boxcar, into that impossible space, and the other figures parted to let it through. It walked to the center of the space and turned to face me, still holding the badge, and made that rattling sound one last time. Then it reached up and pulled the door closed from the inside, the metal slamming shut with a finality that echoed across the abandoned staging area. I stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, understanding that the choice had been made for me. Whatever was in that boxcar wanted to stay there, or at least had accepted that staying there was better than the alternative. I pulled out my phone and deleted the video I'd taken, deleted the photos, deleted every piece of evidence I'd compiled about the disappearances and the contamination and the impossible geometry. Then I walked back to my truck, climbed in, and drove away from that freight yard for the last time. I never went back, never took another route that would bring me anywhere near Gary, Indiana. I found different runs, different yards, Different overnight stops where the only dreams I had were the normal anxiety-laden nonsense that all drivers experience. But sometimes, late at night when the road is empty and the radio is full of static, I think I hear that scraping sound in the distance, rhythmic and patient and utterly relentless. And sometimes, when I check my mirrors, I see a figure in a coverall standing at the side of the highway, watching as I pass, and I know that what happened in that yard didn't end when I drove away. It just stopped being my problem to solve. The boxcar is still there, still collecting, still serving whatever purpose it was designed for by whatever entities or forces operate in the spaces between normal reality. And Thomas Waite, or what's left of him, is still scraping his way forward in that darkness, marking time until someone else gets curious enough or foolish enough to open the door and start the cycle all over again. I hope for their sake they're smarter than I was. I hope they walk away before it's too late. But hope is a weak thing against the pull of mystery, against the human need to know and understand and document. Someone else will open that door eventually, will peer into that impossible space and try to make sense of what they're seeing. And when they do, they'll understand what I understood. That some things are sealed away not to protect them, but to protect us from them. And breaking those seals carries consequences that extend far beyond whatever curiosity prompted the action. That's the real horror of it, not what's in the boxcar, but what we become when we acknowledge it exists. I still have dreams sometimes, though they're different now. Instead of the abandoned staging area and the figure in the coverall, I dream of all the other places like it, all the other sealed spaces and forgotten corners where reality has worn thin and things from elsewhere have pushed through. Every freight yard has them. Every industrial complex, every place where humans have built infrastructure on top of land that never wanted to be developed. We've created a network of weak points, a map of contamination that stretches across the continent, and the things on the other side are patient, so patient, waiting for the right moment or the right person to provide them with access. I was one small part of that larger pattern, one driver who got too close to one weak point in one yard. There are thousands of others, thousands of sealed doors and forbidden sections, and places where workers know not to go even if they can't articulate why. The smart ones listen to that instinct, respect the warnings, and find different routes. The rest of us learn the hard way, if we learn at all, and carry the knowledge like scar tissue, permanent reminders of the price of curiosity in a world where some questions should never be asked, and some answers should never be found. Being an owner-operator means the rig is yours, the profit is yours, and so are the problems. My name is Cullen Braddock, and I've been running my own truck for 8 years now, hauling freight across the Midwest and down into the industrial South, building relationships with shippers and brokers, maintaining my equipment, and doing everything I can to keep the wheels turning and the payments current. It's a precarious existence, one bad breakdown or one slow month away from financial disaster, but it's mine, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Most of my regular runs involve moving manufactured goods from factories in Michigan and Ohio down to distribution centers in Tennessee and Georgia. Steady work that pays decent and keeps me on familiar routes where I know which truck stops have the best coffee and which freight yards will get me loaded or unloaded efficiently. One of those regular stops is a mid-sized intermodal facility outside of Louisville, Kentucky, a place where rail meets road and containers get transferred between modes with reasonable speed and minimal bureaucracy. I'd been using this yard for 3 years without incident, a reliable waypoint on my southern runs, until the night I first heard the horn. The Louisville yard is laid out in a standard configuration, with the active rail sidings running parallel on the eastern side, truck loading docks on the south, and administrative buildings clustered near the main gate on the north. The western section of the yard is mostly unused. a collection of old tracks and rusted infrastructure left over from when the facility was larger and busier. Before, containerization and automation reduced the need for manual switching and extensive rail capacity. Management keeps promising to redevelop that section, maybe sell it off or lease it to another operator. But for now, it just sits there, a ghost of industrial ambition that nobody has the energy or capital to properly address. Most drivers never see the western section because there's no reason to go back there. All the active operations are concentrated on the east and south sides. But as an owner-operator, I'm always looking for quiet places to park during my mandatory breaks, places away from the noise and activity where I can actually get some decent sleep, and the western section's abandoned feel made it perfect for that purpose. The first time I parked back there was purely practical. I'd arrived at the yard around midnight for an early morning pickup. Too late to check in with dispatch, but too early to just sit in the active truck lot, burning time. I drove past the main parking area and followed a service road that ran along the perimeter fence toward the western section, looking for a spot that would be both legal and quiet. The road dead-ended at an old gate that had been chained open years ago and never closed, and beyond it I could see the abandoned tracks stretching into darkness, flanked by security lights that were spaced too far apart to be really useful. I pulled through the gate and found a flat area near what looked like an old maintenance platform, killed my engine, and settled in for a few hours of rest. The quiet was immediate and absolute. None of the clanging and diesel rumble that characterized the active sections. Just the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional creak of metal expanding or contracting in the night air. I slept well that first night. Better than I usually did in truck stop parking lots or active freight yards. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I felt genuinely rested, the kind of deep sleep recovery that makes the job bearable. I drove back to the active section, got my container loaded, and headed out on my run without giving the western section another thought. It became my regular spot after that. Whenever I had overnight time to kill in Louisville, I'd park back in the abandoned section and enjoy the peace and quiet. Other drivers started asking me where I'd been sleeping because I looked less exhausted than usual, and I'd give vague answers about finding a quiet spot, not wanting to share the location and risk it becoming crowded. For 3 weeks, this arrangement worked perfectly, and I congratulated myself on finding a little edge. A small advantage that made the grinding reality of long-haul trucking slightly more tolerable. Then came the night of the horn. I'd parked in my usual spot around 11 p.m., run through my pre-sleep checklist of locking doors and setting alarms, and was just drifting off when the sound jolted me awake. It was a locomotive horn, loud and close. The kind of sustained blast that locomotives give when approaching a crossing or warning workers off the tracks. But there was no reason for a locomotive to be back here in the abandoned section, and the blast went on longer than normal, maybe 15 seconds of sustained noise that echoed off the containers and buildings and seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up in my bunk, heart pounding, and checked my phone. 3:17 a.m. exactly. The horn stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt almost worse than the noise had been. I waited for several minutes, listening for any follow-up sounds, any indication of what had caused the horn blast. Nothing came. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been a locomotive on one of the active tracks, the sound carrying strangely across the yard and seeming closer than it actually was. I lay back down and tried to return to sleep, but the horn had triggered an adrenaline response that kept me awake and alert for another hour before exhaustion finally dragged me under. The next morning, I asked around at the dispatch office, casual inquiries about whether they'd had any unusual locomotive activity around 3 a.m. The dispatcher, a woman named Nola Vexler, who'd been working the yard for 15 years, gave me an odd look. "We don't run night operations on the rail side," she said. All the locomotive movements happen during day shift. At 3 a.m., the only things moving in this yard are trucks. I described what I'd heard, and she frowned. You were parked in the western section, weren't you? When I confirmed, she nodded slowly. Yeah, you're not the first person to report hearing things back there. Old equipment settling, metal stress from temperature changes, sound bouncing weird off all those containers, plays tricks on your ears, especially if you're half asleep. Her explanation made sense, was exactly the kind of rational answer I wanted to hear, but something about her delivery felt rehearsed, like she'd given this speech before and didn't quite believe it herself. I thanked her and headed out on my run, and for the next week I made a point of parking in different locations when I had Louisville overnight stops. But those other spots were noisier, less conducive to real rest, and I found myself getting increasingly tired and irritable as my sleep quality declined. Finally, I gave in and went back to the western section, telling myself that one unexplained noise wasn't worth sacrificing good sleep over. That decision turned out to be a mistake, though it took me a while to understand just how serious a mistake it was. The second time I heard the horn, I was more prepared for it, or at least less startled when it came. Again, it was 3:17 a.m. exactly. Again, it was that sustained blast that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and again, it lasted about 15 seconds before cutting off. This time, I was awake enough to actually listen analytically rather than just reacting to the noise. The horn sounded old, not the clean electronic tones of modern locomotives, but the deeper, more resonant blast of vintage equipment, the kind of horn they used on diesel engines in the 60s and 70s before standardization and safety regulations changed everything. And there was something off about the way it echoed, like the sound was bouncing off structures that shouldn't exist or coming from a space that didn't quite align with normal geography. I got out of my truck and walked around the immediate area, flashlight in hand, looking for the source. The horn didn't repeat, and my search revealed nothing but the usual abandoned infrastructure, rusted tracks and silent containers, and the skeletal remains of equipment that hadn't moved in decades. I went back to my truck and tried to sleep, but couldn't, the horn having triggered that same adrenaline response that made rest impossible. At 6 a.m., when my alarm went off, I was exhausted and frustrated, and I made a decision to actually investigate the western section properly during daylight hours, to map out what was back there and see if I could identify a plausible source for the horn sounds. I had a light load that day and made good time to my delivery point, which gave me the afternoon free to drive back to Louisville and do some exploring. The yard was busy during the day, trucks and forklifts moving constantly, but the western section was as deserted as ever. I parked near the main gate and walked in, following the same route I drove at night, seeing in full sunlight what had only been visible in shadows and security light glow before. The abandoned section was larger than I'd realized, maybe 20 acres of unused tracks and platforms and storage areas, all of it slowly succumbing to rust and weather and neglect. Most of the equipment was exactly what you'd expect to find in a mothballed freight yard. Empty containers stacked 3 or 4 high, sections of rail with weeds growing between the ties, the occasional boxcar or flat car sitting idle on sidings that led nowhere. But as I walked deeper into the section, following the main track westward, I found something that didn't fit the pattern. At the very back of the yard, where the property line met an old industrial access road, there was a locomotive. Not a modern diesel-electric unit, but an older model, probably from the 70s based on the styling, painted in faded blue and gray livery with rust eating through the paint in patches. It was parked on a dead-end siding, facing away from the active yard as if someone had driven it back here with the intention of forgetting about it. The locomotive looked abandoned, windows broken out, access panels hanging open, vegetation growing up around the wheels, but something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I walked around the locomotive, examining it from all angles. The model designation was still visible on one panel, EMD GP38, a workhorse design that thousands of rail operations had used over the decades. Nothing special, nothing unique, just another piece of aging equipment waiting for the scrappers. But when I climbed up to look in the cab, I noticed something odd. The interior was cleaner than it should have been, less weathered, like someone had been maintaining it, or at least keeping the worst of the elements out. The control panels were dusty but intact. The seat was cracked but not rotted, and on the dashboard someone had left a coffee mug. The contents long since evaporated, but the mug itself positioned as if the operator had just stepped away and would be back any moment. I took photos of everything: the locomotive exterior, the cab interior, the positioning on the siding, building documentation without really knowing what I was documenting or why. As I was leaving the locomotive, I noticed something else that seemed significant: fresh grease on the wheels and on some of the undercarriage components. Not fresh, as in applied yesterday, but fresh as in applied within the last year or two, recent enough that it hadn't fully dried or attracted much dirt. Someone was maintaining this locomotive, or at least keeping certain systems lubricated despite the fact that it was parked in an abandoned section of the yard and clearly hadn't moved in years. I made a mental note to ask Nola Vexler about it next time I was in the dispatch office, but I had a feeling she'd give me another one of those rational explanations that didn't quite add up. Another story about maintenance schedules or legacy equipment or bureaucratic inertia. The sun was getting low and I needed to get back on the road, so I walked back to my truck and headed out. The images of that locomotive stuck in my mind like a splinter I couldn't extract. That night, I parked in a truck stop instead of the freight yard, telling myself I needed a break from the western section and its mysteries. But at 3:17 a.m. I woke anyway, a Pavlovian response that my body had developed to that specific time, and in the distance I could swear I heard a horn blast, faint but unmistakable, carried on the wind from the direction of the Louisville yard. I was at least 15 miles away, too far for sound to carry that clearly, but I heard it anyway, or imagined I did, which amounted to the same thing. I lay there in the dark listening to the silence after the horn faded, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was going to go back to that yard, was going to park in the western section again, was going to be there at 3:17 a.m. when the horn sounded. It was like the place had established a claim on me, had marked me somehow as belonging to its rhythm and its mysteries, and resisting that pull would take more willpower than I possessed. The next week I had 3 overnight stops in Louisville, and all 3 nights I parked in the western section near the old maintenance platform. All 3 nights the horn sounded at exactly 3:17 a.m., that same sustained blast that seemed to come from the old GP38 locomotive, even though the locomotive was half a mile away and supposedly non-functional. And all 3 nights I got out of my truck and walked toward the sound, trying to pinpoint its source, trying to understand what I was experiencing. The first night I made it about halfway to the locomotive before the horn stopped and I lost my nerve. The darkness and the silence and the wrongness of the whole situation overwhelming my curiosity. The second night I got closer, within maybe 200 yards of the locomotive, close enough to see its dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. The horn blast came from that direction. I was sure of it. But there was no light in the cab, no sign of anyone operating the controls, just that sustained note echoing across the empty tracks. The third night, I made it all the way to the locomotive, arriving just as the horn finished its blast, and I stood there in the ringing silence examining the machine for any evidence of what had caused the sound. Nothing. The controls were in the same positions I'd seen during my daylight visit. The horn mechanism was covered in rust and bird droppings, and there was no power source that could have activated it anyway. The locomotive was dead, had been dead for years, yet somehow it was sounding its horn every night at the same time with mechanical precision. I climbed into the cab and sat in the operator's seat, trying to imagine what it would have been like to drive this machine when it was still operational. To have that much power under your control, to move freight across the country on rails instead of roads. The coffee mug was still on the dashboard where I'd seen it before, and I picked it up to examine it more closely. There was writing on the side, faded but legible. Louisville Intermodal, Night Operations 97. 26 years ago, back when this locomotive was probably still in regular service, back when the western section of the yard was still active and productive, I set the mug back down and was about to climb out of the cab when I noticed something I'd missed during my earlier visit. There was a logbook wedged between the seat and the control panel, a cheap, spiral-bound notebook with a water-stained cover and pages that had yellowed with age. I pulled it out carefully and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, someone who took pride in maintaining proper records. Night shift log, J. Harrow, switcher operator. I flipped through the pages, seeing entries that documented routine operations, container movements, equipment status checks, all the mundane details of running a freight yard's night shift. The entries ran from January 1997 through October 1997, and then they stopped abruptly, the remaining pages blank. The last entry was dated October 23, 97, and it read 03 Aqua, starting final sweep of western sidings, 0317, and that's where it ended, mid-sentence, the pen trailing off into an illegible scrawl as if the writer had been interrupted or startled or worse. I sat there holding the logbook, feeling cold despite the warm night air. Judd Harrow, the name Nola had mentioned as one of the yard's switcher operators, the name I'd seen on crew rosters and old paperwork. But I'd never met him, never seen him during any of my visits to the yard, and now I understood why. Whatever had happened to Judd Harrow on October 23, 1997, at 3:17 a.m. it had happened here in this locomotive, and it had left a mark on the western section that persisted 26 years later, manifesting as a horn blast that sounded every night at the exact time of whatever incident had occurred. I wanted to show the logbook to someone, to Nola, or to yard management, or to anyone who might be able to explain what had happened. But I also knew instinctively that showing it would be a mistake, would open doors that were better left closed. Instead, I tucked the logbook back where I'd found it and climbed down from the locomotive, walking back to my truck with the certain knowledge that my relationship with the Louisville yard had fundamentally changed. The next morning, I went to the dispatch office with the intention of asking Nola Vexler directly about Judd Harrow and what had happened in October of 1997. But when I walked in, I found a different dispatcher on duty, a younger guy I didn't recognize who told me Nola had taken a few personal days and wouldn't be back until next week. I asked if there were any old-timers around who might remember the yard's operations from the 90s, and the dispatcher shrugged. Most of those guys retired or moved on years ago. This place has pretty high turnover. People don't stick around long-term like they used to. I thanked him and left, frustration building at how the yard seemed to actively resist any attempt to understand its history, throwing up obstacles and deflections whenever I got close to answers. I spent the next week on regular runs, hauling loads through my established routes and trying to maintain the routine that kept my business viable. But the Louisville yard had gotten under my skin in a way I couldn't shake, and I found myself thinking about it constantly, planning my route to ensure I had overnight stops there, arranging my schedule around being present at 3:17 a.m. Other drivers started commenting on my distraction, asking if everything was okay, and I'd deflect with vague answers about business stress or equipment concerns. The truth was, I'd become obsessed with solving the mystery of the horn, with understanding what had happened to Judd Harrow and why the western section of the yard felt so wrong despite looking like any other piece of abandoned industrial infrastructure. When Nola Vexler finally returned to work, I made a point of catching her during a quiet moment in the dispatch office. "I need to ask you about something that happened a long time ago," I said, keeping my voice casual. "October 90, a switcher operator named Judd Harrow. What can you tell me about him?" Nola's expression went carefully neutral, the look of someone who'd been asked a question they'd hoped to avoid. "Why are you asking about Judd?" I told her about finding the logbook, about the incomplete final entry, about wanting to understand the yard's history. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was measured and cautious. Judd Harrow disappeared on October 23, 1997. He was working night shift in the western section, doing routine equipment checks, and he just vanished. They found his locomotive still running on a siding, logbook open, coffee still warm, but no sign of Judd. Search parties went through the whole yard, checked every building and container and piece of equipment. Police investigated. Theories ranged from voluntary disappearance to foul play, but nothing ever got proven and Judd was never found. I asked what she thought had happened. Nola looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between sympathy and warning. "I think Judd saw or experienced something in the western section that we can't explain using normal logic. I think the yard has places where the walls are thin, where things from somewhere else can reach through, and Judd had the bad luck to be in one of those places at the wrong time. The yard management doesn't like that explanation. Prefers to think he just walked away from his job and started a new life somewhere else. But I've been here long enough to know better. The western section is wrong, Colin. It's been wrong since before I started working here, and it'll be wrong long after I'm gone. The horn you're hearing at 317, that's not a mechanical malfunction or an audio illusion. That's an echo of what happened to Judd, a piece of that night that keeps repeating itself because it never got resolved." She paused. "My advice? Find a different place to park. Don't go back to the western section. Whatever's happening there, it's not something you want to get involved with." But I was already involved, had been, since the first night I heard the horn, and Nola's warning only intensified my need to understand. I thanked her for the information and left, my mind racing with implications and questions. If Judd Harrow had disappeared from the western section, if something had reached through from somewhere else and taken him, then what was the horn trying to communicate? Was it a warning, a cry for help, a marker indicating the location of whatever threshold Judd had crossed? The only way to find answers was to be there at 317, to be fully awake and attentive when the horn sounded, to follow whatever trail it might reveal. I knew this was irrational, knew I was letting curiosity override common sense, but the pull was too strong to resist. That night I parked in the western section earlier than usual, around 10 p.m., giving myself time to prepare. I positioned my truck facing the old GP38 locomotive, close enough that I could walk to it quickly, but far enough that I wouldn't be right on top of it when the horn sounded. I set multiple alarms for 3:10 a.m., ensuring I'd be awake and alert well before the critical moment. The hours between 10 p.m. and 3 a.m. dragged interminably, every minute stretching like taffy as I waited in a state of heightened anticipation. I tried to distract myself with paperwork, with checking load boards for future runs, with anything that would make the time pass faster, but my attention kept drifting to the window and the dark shape of the locomotive visible in the distance. At 3:10, my alarms went off and I silenced them immediately, not wanting any sound to interfere with what was coming. I got out of my truck and walked slowly toward the locomotive, flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness and the scattered pools of amber light from the distant security lamps. The yard was absolutely silent. No wind, no traffic noise, Nothing but the sound of my boots on gravel and the occasional creak of metal somewhere in the abandoned infrastructure. I reached the locomotive at 3:15 and climbed up into the cab, settling into the operator's seat with my phone ready to record whatever happened. The coffee mug was still on the dashboard, the logbook was still wedged beside the seat, everything exactly as I'd left it. I checked my phone, 3:16 and 40 seconds. Less than a minute now. 3:17 arrived with the precision of atomic time, and the horn blast began immediately. But this time, sitting in the cab where the horn mechanism was located, I could feel something I hadn't noticed before. The horn wasn't sounding from the locomotive's actual horn, which remained silent and rusted, but from somewhere else, somewhere that seemed to be overlaid on the same physical space but slightly out of phase with normal reality. It was like there were two versions of the locomotive occupying the same location, one dead and abandoned in our world, the other still active and operational in some parallel version where October 23, 1997 was still happening. Still, the sound came from that other locomotive, bleeding through the thin walls between versions, a 15-second sustained blast that seemed to carry meaning I couldn't quite decode. I held my phone up and recorded the horn, watching the audio waveform spike and pulse on the screen, proof that this wasn't just in my head, that the sound existed even if its source didn't. When the horn finished and silence returned, I sat there breathing hard and trying to process what I'd experienced. The overlapping realities theory felt insane, the kind of thing you'd dismiss as fantasy or delusion if you hadn't experienced it directly, but it fit the evidence better than any rational explanation. If the western section of the yard was a place where different versions of reality touched or overlapped, then Judd Harrow might have slipped from one version to another on that October night, might still be there in whatever parallel Louisville existed beyond the thin walls. The question was whether that door could be opened from this side, whether I could find a way to reach through and make contact or bring him back, or at least understand what had happened to him. The smart answer was no, that trying to manipulate forces I didn't understand would end badly, but I'd already established that I wasn't making smart decisions where this yard was concerned. I climbed down from the locomotive and walked a slow circle around it, looking for anything that might indicate a threshold or a weak point. Some physical manifestation of the overlap I'd sensed. Nothing obvious presented itself. Just the same rusted equipment and overgrown tracks I'd seen a dozen times before. But as I completed the circle and came back to the front of the locomotive, I noticed something I'd somehow missed during all my previous visits. The tracks the locomotive sat on didn't actually connect to any of the other sidings or the main yard tracks. They were a complete dead end running maybe 50 yards from where the locomotive sat, and then just stopping, the rails ending abruptly as if they'd been cut or never finished in the first place. I followed the tracks to their terminus and found the rails had been deliberately severed. The cuts clean and precise, and beyond the cut there was nothing but empty ground where tracks had once continued. Someone had physically disconnected this siding from the rest of the yard, isolating the locomotive and creating a space that was technically part of the facility but not actually connected to it in any meaningful way. I walked back to my truck and spent the rest of the night reviewing the recording I'd made of the horn blast, listening to it over and over, trying to hear any pattern or message embedded in the sound. The 15-second duration seemed significant, long enough to convey information, but short enough to be a single coherent statement. I downloaded audio analysis software and ran the recording through various filters, looking for hidden frequencies or unusual characteristics. What I found was strange. The horn sound existed across a much wider frequency range than normal, extending into both infrasonic and ultrasonic ranges that shouldn't be possible for a mechanical horn to produce. It was like the sound was coming from multiple sources simultaneously, all slightly out of sync, creating a layered effect that my ears heard as a single sustained note, But that analysis revealed as something far more complex. When dawn came, I drove back to the dispatch office and found Nola on duty again. I showed her the audio recording and the frequency analysis, explained what I'd experienced sitting in the locomotive cab, and asked her directly what she thought was happening. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she looked at me with an expression of deep concern. "You're getting too close, Cullen. Whatever's in the western section, it's starting to notice you, starting to pull you in the same way it pulled Judd. That recording you made, that's evidence you shouldn't have, proof of something that was never meant to be proven. If you keep pushing, keep investigating, you're going to cross a line you can't come back from." I asked what would happen if I crossed that line. Nola shook her head. "I don't know exactly, but I know people who've gotten too involved with the western section's mysteries. People who started seeing things and hearing things and eventually just stopped showing up to work or stopped making sense when they talked. The Yard has a way of consuming people who pay too much attention to it, of pulling them into its wrongness until they can't function in the normal world anymore." I promised Nola I'd be careful, that I understood the risks, but we both knew I was lying. I was already consumed by the mystery, already too deep to pull back now. The only direction left was forward, toward whatever answers or consequences waited in the western section. I spent the next few days running my regular routes and researching everything I could find about the Louisville Yard's history, looking for other incidents or disappearances that might be connected to what happened to Judd Harrow. What I found was a pattern of low-level strangeness stretching back decades. Workers reporting unusual sounds and sights in the western section, equipment moving or malfunctioning in ways that didn't make sense, people experiencing lost time or memory gaps while working night shifts. None of it was dramatic enough to make headlines or trigger investigations, just a steady accumulation of minor weirdness that management explained away as fatigue or equipment issues or the normal quirks of working in an industrial environment. But when I compiled all the incidents and plotted them on a timeline, I saw something significant. They clustered around specific dates, and those dates corresponded to anniversaries of the original incident on October 23, 1997. Every year on that date, and in the weeks immediately following, the reports of strange occurrences would spike, as if whatever had created the thin walls in the western section was trying to push through more actively during that anniversary window. We were currently in late October, approaching the 26th anniversary of Judd Harrow's disappearance, which meant the western section would be at its most active and most dangerous. The logical response would be to stay away during this period, to give the Yard a wide berth until the anniversary passed and things settled back to their baseline level of wrong. But I'd never been good at logic where this situation was concerned. And besides, I had a feeling that the anniversary window represented an opportunity, a time when the walls were thin enough that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to reach through and make contact with whatever existed on the other side. October 23rd arrived with a sense of inevitability that I'd been building toward for weeks. I cleared my schedule, canceling runs, and turning down loads that would have taken me away from Louisville on that specific night. Other drivers thought I was crazy, passing up good money for no apparent reason, but I couldn't explain that I needed to be in the western section of the freight yard on the anniversary of Judd Harrow's disappearance. Needed to be there at 3:17 a.m. when the walls between worlds were presumably at their thinnest. I arrived at the yard around 9 p.m. and parked in my usual spot near the old maintenance platform, close enough to the GP38 locomotive that I could reach it quickly, but not so close that I'd be overwhelmed if something dramatic happened at the moment of the horn blast. The hours before 3:17 crawled by with agonizing slowness. I tried to rest, tried to prepare mentally for whatever I might encounter, but nervous energy kept me pacing around my truck, checking and rechecking my flashlight batteries, my phone charge, my emergency supplies. Around midnight, I walked over to the locomotive and sat in the cab, rereading Judd Harrow's logbook entries, trying to understand the mind of a man who'd documented routine operations right up until the moment something extraordinary happened to him. The entries were mundane in the extreme, noting container movements and equipment status and weather conditions, a litany of ordinary details that made his sudden disappearance even more jarring. One moment he was doing his job, making his rounds, maintaining the records that someone somewhere thought were important, and the next moment he was gone, erased from this version of reality as cleanly as if he'd never existed. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something I'd missed during all my previous visits to the locomotive. The floor of the cab, near the operator's seat, had a pattern of wear that didn't match normal use. There were marks in the metal, not scratches, but depressions, like something heavy had been pressing down repeatedly in the same spot for a long period of time. I crouched down to examine them more closely and realized they were shaped like footprints. But the pattern was wrong. Normal footprints would show heel and toe impressions from someone standing or walking, but these were perfectly flat, uniform pressure across the entire foot area, like someone had been standing absolutely still in this exact spot for hours or days or longer. And they were positioned facing the controls, as if someone was still standing here even though I couldn't see them, someone whose weight was enough to permanently deform the metal, but whose presence existed just outside the range of normal perception. I stood up quickly and backed away from that spot, suddenly feeling like I was intruding on a space that was already occupied. The cab felt crowded now, the air thick and close despite the broken windows and the cool night breeze flowing through. I climbed down from the locomotive and walked a circuit around it, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, being measured, being judged by something that existed in the overlapping space between this reality and whatever other version pressed against it. When I completed the circuit, I checked my phone. 2:47. 30 minutes until the horn, 30 minutes until whatever was going to happen would begin to happen. I returned to my truck and sat in the cab with the doors locked, watching the locomotive through the windshield, waiting. 3:10 arrived, and I got out of my truck with my flashlight and my phone, both fully charged and ready to document whatever occurred. I walked slowly toward the locomotive, every sense heightened, aware of sounds and movements that I would normally ignore. The yard was silent in a way that felt unnatural, the usual ambient noise of distant traffic and settling metal completely absent, like someone had wrapped the western section in acoustic dampening material. As I approached the locomotive, I noticed the air was changing, becoming heavier, more resistant, like walking through invisible water that grew denser with each step. By the time I reached the cab, I was breathing hard, not from exertion, but from the sheer effort of moving through whatever field or force was building up around the locomotive. I climbed into the cab at 3:15 and sat in the operator's seat, carefully avoiding the spot where the mysterious footprint depressions marked the floor. The coffee mug was gone from the dashboard, I noticed, though I was certain it had been there earlier in the evening. In its place was something else, a small object that I initially mistook for a stone or a piece of metal before realizing it was a watch, an old mechanical watch with a cracked crystal and a band that had oxidized to a greenish patina. I picked it up and turned it over, and on the back was an engraving, J.H., Night Operations. Judd Harrow's watch, left here as a marker or a message, proof that he'd been in this exact spot on the night he disappeared. The watch had stopped at 3:17, the second hand frozen between the third and fourth second markers, marking the exact moment when whatever happened to Judd had occurred. I held the watch in my palm and felt a strange resonance, like the object was vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of normal perception. The feeling intensified as 3:17 approached, the watch growing warmer in my hand, the vibration becoming strong enough to feel clearly. I set it back on the dashboard and pulled out my phone to start recording, wanting to capture whatever was about to happen. 3:16 and 50 seconds. My pulse was racing now, that familiar adrenaline spike of standing on the edge of something unknown and potentially dangerous. 3:16 and 55 seconds. The air in the cab had become so thick I could barely breathe, pressure building like we were descending into deep water. 3:17 exactly, and the horn blast began. But this time it was different, louder, and more complex, layered with the harmonics and undertones that hadn't been present on previous nights. And simultaneous with the horn, the space around me began to shift. The cab's interior blurring and doubling, like two photographs slightly offset and overlaid on each other. I could see the rusted controls and broken windows of the abandoned locomotive, but superimposed on that I could also see clean controls and intact windows, the same cab but in pristine operational condition. And standing in the spot where the footprint depressions marked the floor was a figure, translucent and flickering but definitely present, wearing a Louisville intermodal uniform and staring at the controls with an expression of concentration and growing horror. Judd Harrow, I realized, still here after 26 years, still standing in this cab, still experiencing whatever had trapped him in this moment. I tried to speak, tried to call out to him, but the sound died in the thick air before it could travel more than a few inches. The horn continued its 15-second blast, and as it did, the overlay of past and present grew stronger, the two versions of the cab becoming more equally present until I couldn't tell which was the real one and which was the echo. Judd's figure became more solid, more detailed, and I could see his face clearly now. Could see the expression of someone who knows something terrible is about to happen but can't move or speak or do anything to prevent it. His eyes met mine, and in that moment of contact I felt a rush of information, images, and sensations flooding into my mind faster than I could process them consciously. I saw what Judd had seen on that October night 26 years ago, saw the space around him beginning to tear, saw something reaching through from the other side, something that wanted access to this world and had found a weak point in the western section of the freight yard to exploit. The horn finished its blast, and the overlay snapped back to a single version of reality, the abandoned cab with its rust and broken windows, and no sign of Judd Harrow except the watch still sitting on the dashboard. I sat there gasping for breath, the pressure in the air releasing so suddenly that my ears popped, and I felt momentarily dizzy. When my vision cleared, I grabbed the watch and climbed down from the locomotive, legs shaking, mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. I'd made contact, had seen Judd trapped in that moment of transition, had understood that he wasn't gone so much as stuck, existing in a state between worlds where 26 years could pass in this reality while feeling like seconds in his experience. The question now was whether there was any way to free him, to complete whatever transition had been interrupted, or whether he was doomed to remain frozen in that moment forever, reliving the same 15 seconds every night at 3:17 a.m. I stumbled back to my truck and sat in the cab with the watch clutched in my hand, trying to organize my thoughts into something coherent. The information I'd received during that moment of eye contact was fragmentary and confusing, but certain elements stood out clearly. Judd had been performing routine checks when he'd noticed something wrong with the locomotive's control panel, a reading that didn't make sense given the equipment's supposed status. He'd started investigating, and that investigation had led him to discover that the GP38 wasn't just a locomotive but a focal point, a place where the boundaries between different versions of reality were thin enough to allow passage. Something from one of those other versions had been trying to push through, using the locomotive as an anchor point, and Judd had been caught in the middle of the process, neither fully in his original world nor fully transported to wherever the other side led. The watch in my hand was evidence of that transition, an object that existed simultaneously in multiple states, stopped at the moment of crossing but still present in this reality. I turned it over and over, examining it from every angle, and noticed something I'd missed in the cab. The second hand wasn't completely frozen, it was moving, just incredibly slowly, taking maybe an hour to advance one tick. If that rate was consistent, and if it represented the flow of time in whatever state Judd was trapped in, then, from his perspective, only about 6 hours had passed since that October night in '97. 26 years compressed into 6 hours, a ratio that suggested time worked differently in the overlapping space, dilated or compressed depending on which side of the boundary you were measuring from. I spent the rest of the night in my truck, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about Judd Harrow standing in that cab experiencing the same moment over and over, aware but powerless, trapped in a temporal loop that had no natural ending. When dawn came, I drove to the dispatch office and asked to speak with Nola Vexler, showing her the watch and explaining what I'd experienced during the 3:17 horn blast. She examined the watch carefully, and when she looked up, her eyes were wet with tears she was trying to hide. "I knew Judd," she said quietly. "We worked together before he disappeared. He was a good guy, careful, professional, not the type to just walk away from his job or get himself into trouble. When he vanished, I knew something had happened to him, something wrong, but nobody wanted to hear that explanation. They wanted it to be simple, wanted him to have quit or run off or whatever made the paperwork easier." She handed the watch back to me. "If he's really still out there, still trapped in some kind of loop, then we have to try to help him. Even if it's dangerous, even if it's impossible, we have to try." Over the next week, Nola and I researched everything we could find about the GP38 locomotive and the western section of the yard, looking for any clue that might help us understand how to free Judd from his temporal trap. We discovered that the locomotive had been purchased used in 1985 from a rail operator in Michigan that had gone bankrupt, and before that it had been part of a fleet owned by a mining company in Montana. Tracing its history back further became difficult, the records fragmentary and contradictory, but we found references to incidents at both previous locations. Workers reporting strange experiences around that specific locomotive. Equipment malfunctions that didn't make sense, the same pattern of low-level weirdness that characterized the Louisville Yard's western section. It was like the locomotive itself was the problem, or, more accurately, was a symptom of a larger problem, a physical object that had been built or had evolved into a focal point for dimensional instability. Nola had an idea that seemed crazy, but was the only option we could identify. "If the horn blast at 3:17 represents the moment of maximum overlap between worlds," she said, "then maybe we can use that moment to pull Judd back instead of just observing him. If you're in the cab when the horn sounds, if you're in physical contact with him when the overlay happens, maybe you can anchor him to this reality strongly enough that he snaps back to our version instead of remaining stuck in the between space." I pointed out the obvious problem, that we had no idea what being in physical contact with someone trapped in a temporal loop would do to me, whether it would free Judd or just trap me alongside him, creating two people frozen in that moment instead of one. Nola acknowledged the risk but argued that doing nothing was worse, that leaving Judd trapped forever when we had a possible solution was ethically unacceptable, even if the solution was dangerous. We planned the attempt for the next occurrence of 3:17 a.m., giving me a day to prepare and to make sure my affairs were in order in case things went wrong. I wrote a detailed account of everything I'd experienced and learned, left it sealed in an envelope with instructions to open it if I didn't return, and made sure my truck and business paperwork were organized for whoever would need to handle them if I vanished. The precautions felt melodramatic but necessary. Acknowledgement that I was about to attempt something that could easily go sideways in ways I couldn't predict or prepare for. Nola wanted to be there during the attempt, wanted to be in the western section as backup or witness, but I convinced her to stay in the dispatch office and monitor the situation remotely. If something went wrong, if I disappeared the same way Judd had, I needed someone who knew the full story and could warn others away from repeating our mistakes. The night of the attempt, I arrived at the yard around 10 p.m. and parked near the GP38 locomotive, close enough that I wouldn't have to walk far at the critical moment. The hours before 3:17 were torture, my mind running through every possible outcome, every scenario where this worked or failed or created new problems worse than the one we were trying to solve. I tried to distract myself by reviewing my notes, by double-checking my equipment, by doing anything that would keep my thoughts focused and productive instead of spiraling into anxiety. Around 2 a.m., I gave up on distraction and just sat in my truck watching the locomotive, trying to psych myself up for what I was about to attempt. At 3:10, I climbed into the locomotive cab with Judd's watch in my pocket and my phone set to record. I positioned myself in the operator's seat and placed my hand on the spot where the mysterious footprint depressions marked the floor, the place where Judd would appear when the overlay began. The metal was cold under my palm, and I could feel those same vibrations I'd noticed before, the sense of something resonating just below normal perception. 3:15. My pulse was hammering now, fear and anticipation mixing into a state of heightened alertness where every sensation seemed magnified. 3:16. I closed my eyes and focused on my intention, on the goal of anchoring Judd to this reality, on creating a connection strong enough to overcome whatever force was keeping him trapped. 3:17. And the horn blast began. The overlay snapped into place immediately, the two versions of the cab superimposing with greater clarity than I'd ever experienced before. And under my palm, I felt warmth, solidity, the presence of someone standing exactly where the footprint depressions indicated. I opened my eyes and saw Judd Harrow looking down at me, his expression shifting from concentration to surprise to recognition as he became aware of my presence. He tried to speak, but no sound came out in the thick air, so instead he reached down and gripped my hand, his fingers solid and warm despite his translucent appearance. The contact created a circuit, a connection that I could feel in my bones, and through that connection I could sense what he was experiencing, the horrible loop of time where the same 15 seconds repeated endlessly, where awareness persisted, but action was impossible, where he'd been screaming silently for 26 years, while the world outside continued without him. I tightened my grip on his hand and pulled, not physically but with intention, with will, trying to drag him across the boundary that separated his trapped state from normal reality. The resistance was enormous, like trying to move a mountain, and I could feel the force that held him fighting against my effort, trying to maintain the loop, trying to keep him frozen in that moment. The horn continued its blast, the 15 seconds stretching out subjectively into what felt like hours, and in that extended time I could see the thing that had created this trap, the presence from the other side that had been trying to use the locomotive as a crossing point and had caught Judd in its attempt. It wasn't malevolent exactly, more like indifferent, a force that operated according to rules so alien to our reality that human concepts like intent or morality didn't apply. It didn't care that Judd was trapped, didn't care that 26 years had passed, didn't care about anything except maintaining the stable crossing point it had created. The horn reached its 15th second, and I felt something give, some part of the trap's structure failing under the combined pressure of my pulling and Judd's desire to be free. The overlay shuddered, the two versions of the cab separating and remerging in rapid oscillation. And then, with a sensation like reality tearing, Judd solidified fully, his hand in mine becoming completely corporeal, his weight pressing down on the floor, creating new footprint depressions alongside the old ones. The horn cut off and the overlay collapsed back to a single version of reality. The abandoned cab with its rust and broken windows, and Judd Harrow standing beside me, looking confused and disoriented, but definitely completely present and real. We sat there for a long moment, both of us breathing hard, both of us trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Judd spoke, his voice hoarse from disuse. "How long?" he asked. "How long was I in there?" I told him it had been 26 years since October 23, 1997. He closed his eyes and made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. It felt like 6 hours, maybe 7. I could see everything happening around me, could see the days passing outside the cab, but I couldn't move or speak or do anything except stand there experiencing the same moment over and over. He opened his eyes and looked at me. "Thank you. I don't know how you did it, but thank you for pulling me out." We climbed down from the locomotive and I called Nola to tell her the attempt had succeeded, that Judd was free and apparently unharmed beyond the disorientation of having lost 26 years in subjective 6 hours. She arrived 15 minutes later, having driven from her apartment at dangerous speeds, and when she saw Judd, she stopped dead, staring at him like she was seeing a ghost. "You haven't aged," she said finally. "You look exactly the same as the night you disappeared." Judd examined his hands, his arms, seeming to confirm this observation. I guess time wasn't passing normally for me, or maybe it was passing but my body wasn't experiencing it. I don't know how this works. Nola approached him slowly and then pulled him into a hug that he returned with intensity, both of them holding on like they were afraid the other would disappear if they let go. The aftermath of Judd's return was complicated and strange. Legally, he'd been declared dead after 7 years of absence. His possessions distributed. His accounts closed. His existence archived in the records of people who'd been but were no more. Recreating a legal identity for someone who'd been gone for 26 years but had only aged 6 hours required lawyers and documentation and bureaucratic gymnastics that took months to resolve. The yard management was understandably skeptical of the whole situation, preferring to believe that Judd had voluntarily disappeared in 1997 and was now returning with a convenient story, rather than accept that he'd been trapped in a temporal anomaly in the western section of their facility. But Nola and I vouched for him, and eventually the various authorities involved agreed to process his case as a standard missing person return. No questions asked about the missing decades or the impossible nature of his preservation. Judd moved in with Nola temporarily while he tried to adjust to a world that had changed dramatically during his absence. The technology was different, the politics were different. Most of the people he'd known were gone or had moved on with their lives. He was a man out of time in the most literal sense, trying to find his place in a reality that had continued without him while he stood frozen in a moment that had already passed. We spent hours talking about what he'd experienced, trying to understand the mechanics of the trap and whether there might be other people caught in similar loops at other thin points in reality. Judd described seeing others sometimes during his imprisonment, distant figures trapped in their own moments, unable to interact or communicate, but definitely present in that overlapping space. If they were real, if his perception was accurate, then the phenomenon wasn't unique to the Louisville Yard's western section, and there might be hundreds or thousands of people frozen in temporal traps across the world, silently waiting for someone to free them. I continued working as an owner-operator, but I stopped parking in the western section of the Louisville Yard, stopped going anywhere near the GP-38 locomotive or the disconnected siding where it sat. The yard management eventually had the locomotive removed and scrapped, citing safety concerns and liability issues, though I suspected they really just wanted to eliminate a problem they couldn't explain or control. With the locomotive gone, the 317 horn blasts stopped, the western section returning to normal levels of abandonment and decay, and within a few months drivers were parking back there again without experiencing anything unusual. It was like removing the focal point had dissipated whatever field or force had made the space wrong, allowing reality to seal up its thin spots and return to stable normalcy. But I know that's not the end of it, not really. The locomotive was a symptom, not a cause, and the fundamental instability that allowed it to become a crossing point is still there. Dormant, but not gone. Someday, someone will build something or park something or do something in that section of the yard that will create a new focal point, a new thin spot where the boundaries between worlds become permeable again. And when that happens, when the walls start tearing and the overlays begin, there will be another Judd Harrow caught in the moment. Another person frozen in time and waiting for rescue that may never come. I think about that sometimes. Late at night when the road is empty and the radio is full of static. And I wonder if I should go back to the western section, should monitor it for signs of new problems, should stand ready to help whoever might need it next. But I'm not that brave or that foolish, and besides, I did my part, freed the one person I could reach, and that has to be enough. Judd eventually adapted to the new world, found work as a consultant helping rail operations modernize their safety protocols, using his experience of being trapped as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper equipment monitoring and worker safety. He never talks publicly about what really happened to him, what really caused his 26-year disappearance, but those of us who know the truth carry it like a weight, a knowledge that changes how we see the world and the spaces within it. Every freight yard has its abandoned sections, its old equipment and dead tracks and places where workers know not to go even if they can't articulate why. Most of the time, those places are just forgotten infrastructure, casualties of economic change and technological progress. But sometimes, in certain yards at certain times, those places are thin, and the boundaries between what is and what could be become permeable enough that crossing over becomes possible, intentionally or otherwise. The 317 horn was a warning, a marker indicating one of those crossing points, and ignoring such warnings is how people get lost in the overlaps, how they end up trapped in moments that extend far beyond their natural duration. I still hear horns sometimes, late at night when I'm parked in freight yards across the country, catching a few hours of rest between runs. Most of them are normal, the expected sounds of locomotives and equipment doing what they're designed to do. But occasionally I'll hear one that sounds wrong, that carries harmonics and overtones that suggest it's coming from somewhere other than the visible machinery. And when I hear those, I make a point of moving my truck to a different location, of putting distance between myself and whatever thin spot is calling out in its mechanical voice. I don't investigate anymore. Don't try to understand or document or solve the mysteries that present themselves. I did that once, saw it through to its conclusion, and learned that some knowledge carries obligations I'm not prepared to fulfill. Better to drive away, to find a different yard, to let someone else be the one who hears the wrong time horns and decides to investigate. Maybe they'll be smarter than I was. Maybe they'll walk away before getting involved. Or maybe they'll do what I did, what Judd Harrow did before me, and cross a line they can't come back from unchanged. Either way, it's not my problem anymore, or so I tell myself on the nights when sleep won't come, and the sound of distant horns seems to carry messages I'm trying very hard not to hear.